In the stillness of night, when the stars hang low and the world begins to hush, we drift toward forgotten echoes, echoes of armies beneath burning suns, of kings with trembling hands, of a single choice that shaped 1,000 years. Not all wars are waged for power. Some are born from fear, others from faith, and some from the quiet hunger for something more. Close your eyes and listen, not to the clash of swords, but to the silence that followed them, the silence that changed everything. Tonight, we journey through the shadows of time, into the history of 3 wars that changed the world. Chapter 1, Whispers Before the Storm. Long after the last Roman emperor in the West was dethroned, the echo of Rome still moved through the marble ruins and sunlit hills of a broken empire. But while the western half faded into memory, the eastern half endured, reshaping itself into something new, the Byzantine Empire. It was not just a continuation, but a transformation. Where once stood Rome's soldiers and senators, now rose Orthodox priests, golden domes, and emperors who wore crowns stitched with icons of Christ. Constantinople, gleaming on the Bosphorus, stood not only as a city of stone, but as a fragile idea, the last beacon of a fading classical world. Byzantium looked westward and saw only chaos. Germanic kingdoms squabbled in the dark forests of Europe. The papacy grew in confidence, shaping a new order with Latin and the cross. But the Byzantines turned inward, protecting what remained: language, law, and legacy. They guarded their borders with weary pride, remembering a time when Roman legions stretched from the sands of Africa to the moors of Britannia. But now, all around them, unfamiliar tongues were rising, and familiar enemies drew near once more. The memory of Rome was both shield and burden. To the Byzantines, they were not a footnote but the final flame. They spoke Greek but called themselves Romans. Their emperors prayed for heavenly wisdom yet schemed with worldly cunning. Behind the marble walls of Constantinople, there was beauty, power, and fragility. And beyond those walls, in deserts and hills not yet conquered, history stirred again. For while the ghost of Rome lingered in hymn and mosaic, it could not stop time. New powers were gathering, and with them, new visions of the world. The quiet years after Rome were not years of peace, only silence before a great noise. The kind of silence that hums, low and distant, like thunder just beyond the edge of the sky. Fault lines in the desert. Across the windswept deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, scattered tribes lived by the rhythm of stars and survival. Their world was ancient but divided. The sands held stories older than empire, of caravans and poets, of warriors and merchants. But these people were not yet one. They spoke a common tongue, but their loyalties lay with clan, not country. Their gods were many, their rivalries older than memory. Yet beneath this fractured surface, something was beginning to change. In the silence of mountain caves and the hush of moonlit plains, there came a call, not of conquest, but of truth. The Prophet Muhammad, born among the Quraysh tribe of Mecca, was not raised in palaces or trained in courts. He was a man of the earth and sky, who walked among the poor and listened deeply to silence. His revelations, received over many years, would soon stir the hearts of nomads, traders, and warriors alike. These were not mere words. They were a fire, unseen but unignorable. What began as faith became movement. From Mecca to Medina, the message spread, not with the might of empire, but with the resolve of belief. The tribes, once enemies, began to pray together. The sword was not the beginning, but the last resort. When it came with precision, not recklessness. For this was not a war of borders, but of worlds. Old loyalties cracked, old gods faded. A new unity emerged, one that did not erase the past but redefined it. The desert, once fragmented, was becoming whole. But the transformation was not only spiritual. It was also political, military, and cultural. A once overlooked corner of the world was rising, with clarity, purpose, and astonishing speed. The Byzantine Empire in the north and the Sassanid Persians in the east, long preoccupied with their own grudges, would soon be forced to look south. And when they did, they would find a force they could not understand and could not stop. The desert had always whispered. Now it shouted. What began in quiet reflection would soon reshape continents. This was no longer a world of waiting. The storm was coming. The age of steam and steel. Centuries later, on the opposite side of the world and the map, another storm gathered. But this one was made of smoke, soot, and the grinding sound of iron wheels. The age of steam had arrived, and with it came something unlike anything before. Empires once built on swords now built on steel. Coal-fired furnaces and fueled ambitions. Cities expanded. Railroads reached out like iron veins across nations. The world, once vast, was shrinking, and with it, the margins for peace. Britain stood first among the great powers, its factories alive with noise and its ships ruling the seas. But others were close behind. France, Germany, Russia, each transformed by industry, each hungry for more. In boardrooms and royal courts, the new game was not just about power, but progress. Colonies were no longer seen as distant burdens, but as sources of wealth and pride. The scramble for Africa, the competition for Asia, the race to modernize, all of it pointed to a future not of cooperation, but confrontation. And yet, beneath the polished speeches and grand exhibitions, there was unease. Technology had made war more deadly. Telegraph lines could send orders faster than messengers. Rifles could fire farther and kill quicker. Trains could move armies in days instead of weeks. The machines that powered daily life also promised destruction on a scale no one had yet seen. Old alliances were tested. New ideologies emerged. Nationalism surged, not just as pride, but as pressure. People were told to belong, to fight, to fear the other. A wrong word could start a riot. A single shot, it seemed, could start a war. And somewhere beneath all this progress, something human was being lost. The slow pace of peace, the patience of diplomacy, the willingness to wait. As factories hummed and smokestacks reached into gray skies, history held its breath once more. The world had changed, not gently, but with fire and noise. And the wars that would come from this era would not be fought over a village or a border, but over entire ways of life. What Rome once ruled by roads, and what deserts once moved with prayer, would now be tested by metal and might. History holds its breath. If you could stand at the edge of time, just before these great wars began, you would feel it, the pause. Not silence, but something deeper. A stillness heavy with possibility. In every corner of the world, from crumbling ruins to crowded factories, from desert prayer to parliamentary speech, there was a tension. Stretched tight but not yet broken. The kind that makes a soldier stand straighter, or a poet choose their words more carefully. The kind that makes empires nervous and rebels hopeful. In Byzantium, priests still lit candles beneath mosaics, while generals watched distant borders. In Arabia, a revelation moved hearts faster than horses. And in Europe, men in dark suits signed treaties with shaking hands, unsure whether they were building peace or only delaying war. The world did not know what was coming, but it felt it. Just as the sea pulls back before a wave, history had receded, drawing breath before unleashing its force. This chapter is not about battles. Not yet. It is about what comes before them, the quiet that carries weight, the whispers that shape storms. For war does not begin with gunfire. It begins with restlessness, with fear, with hope, with dreams of something greater or something gone. And so we end not with a bang, but with a breath. A long, patient breath held by civilizations both old and new. Across deserts and oceans, across palaces and prayer mats, the world, in its own quiet way, was waiting. And soon it would awaken. Chapter 2. The Sword and the Crescent. The year was 632 CE. The sands of Arabia were still, but the winds of history had begun to stir. In Medina, the Prophet Muhammad had breathed his final breath. Around him, those who had walked beside him wept, not only for the man, but for the mission he carried. In life, he had united the tribes of Arabia under one banner, calling them to a new path, one guided not by idols or tribal feuds, but by submission to one God. Now, with his passing, the question remained, Would this unity fade like dust in the wind, or would it grow into something no empire could contain? The first answer came swiftly. Abu Bakr, the Prophet's close companion, stood firm. As the first caliph's successor, he declared that the mission would not end with death. It would live and it would move. His leadership turned sorrow into strength. Under his command, the Ridda Wars put down tribal rebellions, and Islam remained whole. But it was more than defense. A new energy flowed from the desert, carried by men who had once known only skirmishes and clan feuds. Now they rode with purpose, and with surprising unity. The sword no longer served personal pride, it served the Ummah, the Muslim community. It was under the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, that this purpose became movement. The tribes, now bonded in belief, began to push beyond the peninsula. North toward the Fertile Crescent, west toward Egypt, east into Persia. But perhaps the greatest test lay to the north, where the walls of the Byzantine Empire still rose, imperial, golden, ancient. There, in the shadow of Constantinople, Islam would face its fiercest opponent. Not in scattered tribes or old traditions, but in a world-spanning empire with centuries of rule behind it. But this was not a war for plunder alone. The men who marched north recited verses, not chants. They prayed before battle. They fought not to erase history, but to fulfill what they believed was a divine trust. In this growing clash between crescent and crown, the seeds of something eternal were planted. They would take root in the soil of Syria, bloom in cities like Damascus, and echo through history not just in conquest, but in faith. Clash at Yarmouk. The year was 636 CE. Along the banks of the Yarmouk River, near the borders of modern-day Syria and Jordan, a strange and terrible silence fell. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm, a silence heavy with breath and prayer. On one side stood the army of Byzantium, steel-armored, orderly, veterans of Rome's long campaigns. On the other side stood the Muslim forces, lighter, swifter, led by men whose names would soon ring through history. Khalid ibn al-Walid, once a sword of the Quraysh, now wielded the blade for Islam. He was known as the Sword of God, and this battlefield would etch that name into legend. The Byzantines had the numbers. Estimates say their army was nearly double in size. But numbers, as history often shows, are not the only measure of strength. Over 6 days of bitter combat, the desert winds turned against the empire. Muslim cavalry sliced through flanks with terrifying speed. Arrows flew, dust rose, and from the chaos came clarity. The Byzantine formations began to bend and then break. Soldiers who once served emperors now scattered like leaves in a whirlwind. The terrain played its part. The Yarmouk Valley was not forgiving. Steep cliffs, narrow passages, and sudden gusts of wind all favored those who knew the land, and who moved with the land rather than against it. The Muslim forces did not fight as an army bound by drill alone, but as a movement bound by belief. Unity was not only in command, it was in cause. And then it was over. The Byzantine army collapsed not just in body, but in spirit. Many perished, others fled, few returned. The empire's hold over Syria was shattered in a single moment of historical thunder. In the calm that followed, the world changed. The victory at Yarmouk was not just tactical, it was symbolic. It showed that a new force had entered history's stage, one not easily turned back by old empires or golden thrones. For the Muslim world, Yarmouk was a sign. It proved that belief, when shared and sustained, could overcome armor, wealth, and even time. For the Byzantines, it marked the beginning of a long retreat, a slow unraveling of once unchallenged dominance in the East. But for all who remember, it was a place where two visions of the world collided, and one walked away forever changed. The fall of Damascus. Just 2 years after Yarmouk, another echo shook the heart of the Byzantine world. Damascus, one of Rome's oldest and proudest cities, fell. Not to betrayal nor to siege alone, but to the unrelenting tide of belief and strategy. It was a city of trade and beauty, with Roman arches and ancient roots. It had watched empires rise and fall, and now it would watch the banner of Islam rise above its walls. The capture of Damascus was not sudden. It came through careful movement, firm negotiation, and, when needed, force. Khalid ibn al-Walid once again played a key role. But here, the sword was matched by restraint. When the Muslim forces entered the city, they did not destroy it. They offered terms of peace to those who remained. The churches stood. The markets continued. Life adjusted but did not vanish. For many within Damascus, it was not the end they had feared. The new rulers did not demand conversion. Instead, they introduced a new way of governance, one that combined religious law with practical justice. Christians and Jews, known as people of the book, were allowed to worship and live under protection. A tax was paid, yes, but so too was peace kept. In an age when conquest often meant destruction, this was a different kind of victory. Damascus became more than a prize. It became a center, a hub of administration, learning, and faith. Under the Umayyads, who would soon establish their capital there, the city would shine in new ways. Mosques rose alongside Roman stone. Arabic began to replace Greek. Yet beneath every new brick lay older ones, ancient bones, as it were, on which a new future was being built. This moment, the fall of Damascus, marked the transformation of a campaign into a civilization. The desert warriors who had once lived under tents now governed from marble halls. The pulse of Islam had reached the arteries of empire, and it beat not with chaos, but with purpose. Faith, not just steel. To say these wars were won only by blades would be to miss the deeper truth. The Arab-Byzantine wars were not simply about lines on a map or castles taken. They were about hearts claimed and minds stirred. What moved the Muslim armies was not only the promise of land or wealth, but the gravity of creed. Their cause was more than national, it was sacred. Before battle, they prayed. In hardship, they remembered the Prophet's words. The Quran, newly compiled and fresh in memory, was their guide. It gave not just laws, but language, poetry, meaning. They did not merely conquer, they offered a vision. To some, it was foreign. To others, it was clarity. Among those who joined them were not only Arabs. Over time, local populations began to see in Islam something different, something personal. Its simplicity, its unity, and its justice attracted many. Converts came from many walks of life, farmers, traders, thinkers. They found in Islam a way to belong to something larger than themselves, something that crossed tribe and tongue. Even those who did not convert often found themselves living in relative peace under Muslim rule. The idea of tolerance within a structure allowed communities to continue even as leadership changed. It was not perfect nor without struggle, but it was striking in contrast to the often brutal transitions of empire elsewhere. And so, the war between Byzantium and Islam was fought with more than swords. It was fought with ideas, with scripture, with the belief that the world could be different, that power could serve something higher than empire, that a man from the desert could change the fate of cities thousands of miles away, not by gold, but by faith. By the end of the 7th century, the Byzantine world was smaller but not gone. Constantinople would still rise behind its mighty walls. But the Islamic world was now more than a movement. It was a civilization, one with roads, schools, prayer, and promise. The sword had opened the door, but it was belief that walked through and stayed. Chapter 3: A Sea of Fire. In the beginning, the sea had no part in their story. The early Arab world was forged under sun and stone. Its roots deep in sand, its lifeblood carried not by rivers but by caravans across dry land. Yet, with conquest came curiosity. As the Arab armies moved across the Levant, Syria, and into Egypt, they found themselves gazing upon something they had not ruled before, the sea. Blue and endless, the Mediterranean lay before them not just as a boundary, but as an opportunity. At first, they were strangers to it. The Arabs were desert riders, not seafarers. Their victories had come on horses, across dunes and hills, not on decks of ships. But they were observant. In the great cities they now controlled, Damascus, Alexandria, Tripoli, they found remnants of old empires. Byzantine docks, Roman shipyards, Phoenician harbors. And with them, blueprints, scrolls, broken hulls, captured vessels, the pieces of an ancient puzzle. Arab craftsmen, working with wood from the mountains of Lebanon and Syria, began to shape something new. They took Byzantine techniques, Phoenician methods, and added their own ideas. The result was not imitation, but adaptation. Shipyards in places like Tyre and Acre began to hum with activity. Masts rose like trees in bloom. Oars were carved with care. Hulls hardened with layers of cedar and pitch. What had once been a land power was now becoming something else entirely. Slowly, almost silently, a new navy was being born. Not in the echo of Roman tradition, but in the footsteps of conquest. As sails caught wind for the first time, they carried not only warriors, but the dreams of an empire unafraid of new frontiers. And on those winds rode the future of the sea itself. The Battle of the Masts. The year was 655, and the sea itself stood divided. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, still held sway over the waves. Their fleets had dominated for generations, their knowledge unmatched, their presence unchallenged. But from the southern shores of the Mediterranean, something unexpected had risen. A navy born of land warriors, still new, still untested, yet bold enough to challenge the old order. The two forces met off the coast of Lycia, near a place the Arabs called a wari, the masts. It would become one of the most important naval battles in early Islamic history. On one side stood the experienced fleets of the Byzantines, their ships large and their confidence deep-rooted. On the other, the newly formed Muslim fleet, lighter, faster, and driven by the spirit of expansion. There were no cannons then, no towering battleships. Naval combat was intimate, brutal, and chaotic. Ships collided, arrows rained. Men fought not only with blades but with their bare hands. Boarding was common. Victory came not through long-range warfare but through courage and coordination. The Arabs had one advantage: faith. Many saw their battle not just as war, but as destiny. Caliph Uthman had supported the campaign despite internal doubts, and commanders like Muawiyah, a skilled governor from Syria, had prepared his fleet with care. The sailors, though less seasoned, were hungry for a place in history. Against expectation, the Byzantines fell. Their fleet was broken. The sea that had once served as a Roman road now flowed with new names and new flags. The Battle of the Masts didn't just mark a victory. It marked a transformation. The Arabs were no longer landlocked. They had entered the sea not as guests, but as heirs. In the aftermath, the sea felt changed. The Byzantines had tasted a kind of defeat they did not expect. And the Muslims, once untested, now had proof that their power could stretch beyond the dunes and hills. That the Mediterranean, long a Roman lake, could become something new under eastern skies. The ports changed hands. With the Roman fleet weakened, the great coastal cities began to sway like trees in a changing wind. First came Alexandria, the jewel of Egypt, founded by a conqueror, shaped by philosophers and priests, and protected for centuries by Roman ships and soldiers. But the Romans were no longer the sea's only master. In 641, Alexandria surrendered to the forces of Islam. Its lighthouse still shone, but now it cast its light upon new rulers. Then came Acre, a city of stones and salt. It had long been a harbor for Roman and Greek ships. But with each year, its walls began to echo with new prayers. Mosques were built beside warehouses. The call to prayer mingled with the cries of fishmongers and the creak of wooden hulls. Tyre followed. Once a Phoenician stronghold, it had seen empires rise and fall. Now it too began to change. The minaret slowly replaced the bell tower. The crescent appeared where once there had been eagles. But the change was not just in symbols or structures. It was in the rhythm of the ports. Pilgrims moved alongside merchants. Arabic became the language of trade. Gold dinars replaced Byzantine coin. And the sea, once a barrier between east and west, began to act as a bridge. For the Arabs, these cities were not only trophies of conquest. They were keys to trade, to culture, to the world. In the great harbors, knowledge moved as freely as goods. Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities lived side by side. Sailors carried spices, silks, and stories from North Africa to Sicily, from Syria to Spain. What had once been Roman was now a crossroads. And the ports, with their sails and spice markets, became places where old empires faded and new worlds quietly took root. Trade, war, and the sea. The Mediterranean had always been a stage for history, but now it changed its actors. With Roman rule in retreat, the sea became contested again. Not just by empires, but by ideas, by economies, by faiths. The line between war and commerce blurred like mist over the waves. For the Arabs, the sea offered both profit and protection. With fleets stationed in Cyprus and Crete, they could strike quickly, but also defend their growing trade routes. Sugar, textiles, glass, and perfumes moved across the water in Arab ships. Alongside them came dates, camels, papyrus, and books filled with wisdom from distant lands. But these waters were not peaceful. Pirates roamed freely. Byzantine ships still patrolled parts of the sea, especially near Constantinople. And as Arab expansion reached into North Africa and Sicily, new conflicts arose. The war was not always about land anymore. It was about lanes of trade, access to islands, control of wind and current. The sea became a battlefield and a lifeline. Cities like Tunis and Tripoli were fortified not just against land invasions, but against rival navies. Forts stood tall by the shore, cannons ready to protect the flow of wealth that the sea provided. But even in this, there was beauty. Sailors learned the stars not just for prayer, but for passage. They mapped winds and tides, drew charts, and built compasses. Arab science grew with the sea. Astronomy, geography, and mathematics all flourished in this new maritime age. The transformation was slow, but real. The Roman past had given way to an Arab future, and the Mediterranean, once a lake of empire, now became a mirror of shifting power. Not just a sea, but a story, told in wood and sail, in mosque and market, in the endless sound of waves against stone. By the end of the 7th century, the sea no longer belonged to one people. It was shared, contested, alive. The Arabs, once people of the desert, had become its stewards, its traders, its warriors, its navigators. And in the moonlight on the waves, the fire of their rise could still be seen, flickering softly across the water. Chapter 4: Walls of Constantinople. It was the spring of the year 674, and the sun rose quietly over the waters of the Bosphorus, casting long shadows on the walls of Constantinople. The city, once the proud capital of Constantine's dream, now stood on the edge of a long and bitter trial. For months, word had traveled ahead of the coming storm that an army was marching from the deserts of Arabia, vast and determined, carrying banners of a rising faith. The Umayyad Caliphate, young and full of zeal, had set its sights on the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople, the city of emperors, relics, and saints, was no longer just a place. It had become a symbol, a prize, and now it would become a battlefield. The people of the city knew what approached. Behind its towering walls lived not only soldiers and nobles, but craftsmen, mothers, monks, and children. Nearly 800,000 souls filled its streets, each with their own story, each with their own prayer. For many, the defense of the city was not just about land. It was a test of faith, a struggle between worlds. The great triple walls that wrapped around the western edge of the city stood like a sleeping dragon, ancient and unbeaten. Built layer upon layer over centuries, they were more than bricks and mortar. They were a promise that this city would endure. The first line of defense stood tall, lined with towers spaced evenly, their round tops peaking above the trees. Behind it rose the second wall, and then a third, crowned with catapults and watchmen. Outside these walls, a broad moat cut deep into the earth, filled with water or sharpened stakes, depending on the season. The defenders had prepared well. Grain stores were counted and sealed. Rainwater was collected and preserved. Oil was rationed, and prayers were whispered day and night, in homes, in churches, in the great Hagia Sophia, whose golden dome still shimmered in the morning light. As the Arab fleet arrived, filling the horizon with sails, the city stood still. There were no songs, only the sound of the wind brushing the banners, and the quiet creak of the city's great gates closing shut. Gates that would not open again for nearly 4 years. The mystery of Greek fire. By sea, the attackers hoped to press their advantage. The Arab navy had sailed up from Syria and Egypt, carrying warriors, wood, and willpower. Their plan was clear: to choke the city from all sides, to blockade its harbor, to starve it into surrender. But Constantinople had one more secret, hidden deep within its walls. A weapon not made by swords or catapults, but by fire. It was called Greek fire, though no outsider would ever truly know what it was made from. Its recipe was guarded more tightly than any treasure, passed only from emperor to engineer in whispers and sealed scrolls. To the Arab fleets, it appeared as a line of Byzantine ships drifting gently across the waves. But then, from long tubes at their prows, erupted tongues of flame, green and angry, like something pulled from the mouth of a dragon. The fire did not float on water. It devoured it, clung to sails and flesh, could not be put out with water. When the first ships were struck, panic followed. Men leapt into the sea only to find that the fire followed them. Oars caught alight. Wooden decks groaned and cracked as they burned from within. In the chaos of those first naval battles, the Arab fleet reeled. They had never seen anything like it, not even in the desert's cruelest suns. The Byzantines, few in number, had used the fire not as a blunt tool, but as a whisper of fear. They struck fast, then vanished behind their harbor chains. The weapon was used sparingly, carefully, not to win the war outright, but to change its shape. From that moment forward, the Arab fleet could not press the city as easily. Every nightfall brought the fear that the fire might come again, sliding silently across the dark waters. For the defenders, it was a small miracle, not enough to claim victory, but enough to buy time. And in a siege, time was as precious as blood. Siege machines and suffering. The years passed slowly. What began as a siege in 674 stretched into a haunting cycle of waiting and withstanding. The Arab forces, unable to breach the city directly, built camps along the Marmara coast and across the Golden Horn. Each spring, they returned with new weapons. Siege towers, tall, wooden structures on wheels, were dragged into place, only to be set aflame by arrows. Great battering rams rolled toward the walls, but found no cracks to exploit. Sometimes the attackers would try to tunnel beneath the earth, hoping to collapse the foundations from below. But the Byzantines knew their land too well, and met each effort with their own counter-tunnels, filled with traps and ambushes. In winter, the siege eased. The Arab army pulled back slightly, as snows and ice made movement difficult. But the city could not rest. The winters were cruel, and inside the walls, suffering began to grow. Grain stores ran low. Bread became thin. Animals once kept for farming began to disappear from the streets. Sold, slaughtered, or stolen. Disease crept in like a shadow, quiet and hungry. For the children, the siege became their childhood. For the elderly, it was the last sound they would hear. Yet still, the people did not break. The emperor, Constantine IV, moved among his soldiers and citizens alike, not from a throne but on foot, bearing the same cold, the same hunger. He visited churches where candles flickered weakly and choirs sang through dry throats. He held councils beneath torchlight, drawing lines on maps no larger than the parchment they were printed on. Every day brought some new struggle, yet also, somehow, a quiet defiance. Outside, the Arabs built canals to cut through the land and bring their ships closer. But the Byzantines flooded the trenches. Every innovation was met with a counter. Every fire answered with water. What one side built, the other dismantled. And through it all, the walls, battered, burned, and burdened, held strong. The siege became less a battle and more a test of endurance. Neither side could claim victory, yet neither would yield. It was not the clash of swords that shaped this war, but the silence between them. The siege lifts, but not the threat. At last, in the year 678, the rhythm changed. The Arab forces, worn down by years of failed assaults, disease, and dwindling supplies, began to pull away. The Caliph Muawiyah I, wise and calculating, saw that the prize he sought could not yet be taken. The cost had grown too great. The retreat was slow, measured, and deliberate. There was no dramatic flight, no collapse. just sails lowering one by one. Siege towers abandoned, camps quietly emptied. Inside Constantinople, the bells rang for the first time in years. Not in alarm, but in cautious celebration. People emerged from their homes blinking in the light, thinner than before, older, wearier. Children who had learned to crawl in silence now ran through the streets shouting. The gates were opened. Fields, long untended, were planted again. The Hagia Sophia, dim for too long, blazed with candles. And yet, in every joy there was also restraint, for they knew this was not the end. The siege had lifted, but the memory of it had taken root in the heart of the empire. The Byzantines understood that the Arab world, though held back, was not broken. And the Arabs understood that the city behind those walls, though bloodied, was not theirs to claim, not yet. In the years that followed, peace was briefly negotiated. Tribute was exchanged. But beneath it all, both empires prepared. The siege of 674 to 678 had not decided the fate of the world, but it had revealed its shape. A new force had risen in the south, no longer held to the sands but sailing the seas. And in the north, a city that had seemed invincible now knew what it meant to be tested and to survive. So the walls of Constantinople, those stone ribs of an ancient city, stood taller in the memory of history. Not because they were never touched, but because, touched by fire and time, they did not fall. Chapter 5. The Crusades begin. The year was 1095, and winter crept gently over the countryside of France. In the town of Clermont, crowds gathered beneath a gray sky, their breath rising like mist, their hearts drawn not by trade or celebration, but by a sermon. At the center stood Pope Urban II, a man wrapped in simple robes but filled with fiery purpose. What he said would ripple across continents. With a raised hand and trembling voice, he spoke of Jerusalem. Once sacred, now held, he claimed, by unbelievers. He painted a picture of Christian pilgrims harassed on their journeys, of holy places defiled, of a faith in danger. His words were not quiet pleas. They were thunder, clear and commanding. He called on the knights of Europe to take up the sword not for land or coin, but for the soul. Deus vult, they cried. God wills it. From noblemen to peasants, a surge began. Not a simple army, but a movement. Crosses were stitched to cloaks, weapons were blessed, and hearts were stirred by a new kind of mission. It was not just about Jerusalem, it was about redemption. To go was to cleanse one's sins. To fight was to win God's favor. It was war, yes, but clothed in sacred light. Europe, fractured, weary, poor, suddenly found unity in a cause that soared higher than kings. Families wept, churches prayed, and roads filled with thousands of men who had never seen the East, now marching toward it. The First Crusade had begun, not sparked by greed, but by a vision, a call that turned swords into instruments of salvation, and war into something that felt, at least to them, like worship. The taking of Jerusalem. For long years passed before the Crusaders reached the gates of Jerusalem. Their journey had carved trails through mountains, deserts, and enemy lands. Disease thinned their numbers. Hunger gnawed at them, yet still they pressed on, driven by faith, fury, and the promise of heaven. In July of 1099, they stood at last before the holy city. The city that had lit the fire in their souls now rose before them, walled and defiant. Behind those walls were not just soldiers, but civilians. Muslims, Jews, Christians. Families living amid shrines and stones so old they whispered the breath of prophets. The siege was relentless. Battering rams pounded. Ladders scraped against stone. Days burned beneath the sun. And then Jerusalem fell. What followed was not a quiet victory. It was a storm. Streets ran red. The Crusaders, believing themselves warriors of divine justice, moved through the city like a flood. Mosques were emptied with fire. Temples echoed with cries. Bodies lay in courtyards, sanctuaries, streets. No corner was spared. It was not the holiness of Jerusalem that was remembered in that moment, but its horror. And yet, to the Crusaders, it was the triumph of the age. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was restored. Crosses were raised. Prayers filled the air. The city that had seemed so distant in the Pope's sermon was now a jewel in Christian hands. But the cost was etched deep into the stones. The massacre of 1099 would not be forgotten. To the people of the East, it was not salvation, it was slaughter. And though the Crusaders called themselves pilgrims, history would remember them also as conquerors. Jerusalem was taken, but peace was not. This war of spirit and steel had only just begun. Byzantium caught between worlds. Far to the northeast, where the golden domes of Constantinople shimmered above the Bosphorus, the Byzantine Empire watched the unfolding storm with anxious eyes. Emperor Alexios I had once asked for help. A few skilled knights to push back the Seljuk Turks who had chipped away at his eastern borders. What arrived was a tidal wave. Tens of thousands from the west, armored in faith and iron, crossed into his lands. At first, Alexios welcomed them cautiously. Food was offered, gold exchanged, but as the First Crusade moved on, he began to see what had truly come. These were not mercenaries under his command. They were a crusade under no throne but heaven's. And they were not always loyal. Some Crusader leaders refused to return cities they captured. Others took Byzantine towns for themselves. The alliance began to crack. Suspicion bloomed. Westerners saw the Byzantines as soft, too diplomatic. Easterners saw the Crusaders as reckless, too wild. The great Christian unity that Pope Urban had hoped for began to falter. Byzantium stood between two worlds, between the Latin West and the Islamic East. It tried to balance, tried to broker, but the storm did not care. In the decades that followed, more crusades would come, and many would pass through Constantinople not as guests, but as plunderers. In 1204, it would be sacked by crusaders. The city Alexios once ruled, the jewel of Christian East, would burn under the banners of those who claimed to protect the faith. The Crusades, meant to defend Christendom, had torn it. Byzantium, once mighty, began its long decline, not because of Muslim armies, but because of Christian ones. In this war for holiness, even allies became wounds. Cross and crescent. To call the Crusades just wars over land would miss the heart of them. They were battles of belief, cross against crescent, heaven against heaven. Islam, by the 11th century, was not a stranger to faith or power. The Islamic world stretched from Spain to Persia, filled with scholars, cities, and soldiers. Jerusalem was sacred to Muslims too, home of Al-Aqsa, the place of the Prophet's ascension. It was not merely a city, it was a symbol, and now it had been taken. The Muslim world, at first divided, began to stir. Leaders rose: Zengi, Nur al-Din, and later Saladin. They saw the Crusaders not as pilgrims, but as occupiers. One by one, fortresses were tested. Battles waged not just on plains, but in memory. Each siege was a statement. This land was not abandoned. In 1187, Saladin recaptured Jerusalem, not in fire, but in restraint. He allowed Christian pilgrims safe passage. He spared civilians. His mercy stood in sharp contrast to 1099. It was a new chapter, but the wars would not end. More crusades followed. Some never even reached the Holy Land. Others turned on each other. Blood flowed in the name of peace. And yet, beyond the swords, something else stirred. East met West. Ideas crossed with armies. Medicine, astronomy, architecture, whispers of each other's world began to seep through the walls of war. The Crusades were scars, but they were also mirrors. They showed how belief can uplift and destroy, how sacred places can become battlegrounds, and how faith, when used as a banner in battle, can leave behind more questions than answers. The cross and the crescent had collided, not just in Jerusalem, but in the hearts of millions. And though the wars faded, their echoes would never truly disappear. Chapter 6. The Rise of Saladin. The world Saladin was born into was not one of peace or promise. The lands of Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia in the 12th century were fractured, scattered into rival kingdoms and warlord-led provinces. The Crusaders had carved their own realms along the eastern Mediterranean, while the Muslim world, rich in spirit but weakened by division, struggled for unity. In this swirling storm of power and pride, A boy named Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to history as Saladin, was born in Tikrit, near the banks of the Tigris River. His family was Kurdish, and though noble in origin, they held no throne. Saladin was not destined by lineage to rule, but by vision, patience, and clarity. As a young man, he entered the service of his uncle, a military commander under Nur ad-Din, a rising Muslim leader determined to push back against Crusader advances. Saladin's rise was slow, steady, and quiet. He did not burn with wild ambition, but with calm resolve. He studied warfare not as a thirst for conquest, but as a way to protect what he saw as sacred. He read the Quran with care and lived by its ethics. In the courts and camps of Egypt and Syria, people began to whisper of this young commander who led not with rage, but with restraint. When Nur ad-Din died, and chaos returned to the Muslim world, Saladin did not seize power, he steadied it. By 1174, Saladin was the Sultan of both Egypt and Syria. And yet, even as armies gathered beneath his banners, he moved with patience. He did not rush into war. He consolidated his rule, built alliances, and, above all, focused on unity. He knew that, to face the Crusaders, the Muslim world had to heal itself first. Through careful diplomacy, moral example, and subtle strength, he brought together princes who once warred against one another. Tribes swore loyalty not out of fear, but out of faith in his fairness. Slowly, the broken crescent began to mend. Saladin had no crown of gold, no royal name carved in stone. He was forged in fire, shaped by faith, and lifted by the will of those who believed in something greater. His rise was not loud. It was steady, soft like a rising dawn, and behind it, a purpose formed, one not of hatred, but of harmony. The Battle of Hattin. The year was 1187. The Crusader states, once bold and growing, had grown rigid and reckless. King Guy of Lusignan, ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, held his court with confidence, but not with care. Across the desert lands of Galilee, Saladin had drawn the Crusaders into a trap. He knew the land, the heat, the thirst. He knew that war was not only fought with steel, but with silence, sun, and sand. The Frankish army marched under a burning sky, thousands strong, drawn toward the horns of Hattin by reports of a besieged Muslim town. They brought relics, including the true cross, and believed victory was assured. But Saladin had taken the springs. The wells were dry, the fields were dust. His men, shaded and rested, surrounded the Christian host as it stumbled and gasped beneath the desert heat. By the morning of July 4th, the Crusader army was broken. Arrows fell like rain. Fires were set in the dry grass. The Franks, tired and desperate, found themselves trapped between two hills, unable to fight or flee. Saladin waited, then struck. It was not a battle of brutality, but of precision. His archers harried the enemy. His cavalry cut off retreat. When the Crusader knights charged, they found only smoke, heat, and death. Thousands were taken captive. King Guy was spared, but the true cross was lost, its symbolic power shattered. The Battle of Hattin was more than a victory. It was a turning point. The Crusader presence in the Holy Land would never recover. Castles crumbled. Roads once ruled by Christian knights fell into silence. And through it all, Saladin did not boast. He did not gloat. He simply moved forward, step by step, toward Jerusalem, not with a sword raised high, but with his eyes set on balance. Jerusalem without slaughter. In October of that same year, Jerusalem, heart of the Holy Land, stood before Saladin's gaze. For nearly 9 decades, the city had been under Crusader control. Walls rose tall, churches stood sacred, and the memories of 1099, the year the Crusaders had taken the city in blood, lingered like shadows in the streets. Saladin could have taken it by storm. He had the numbers, he had the strength, but he chose another path. He offered terms, he sent envoys, he gave the defenders, led by Balian of Ibelin, a chance to surrender peacefully, sparing the city the fate it had once suffered. After negotiations, Jerusalem opened its gates. There was no massacre, no looting, no fire or fury. Instead, there was order. There was quiet. Christian families who could pay were allowed to leave freely. Those who could not were released by Saladin's own charity or by the donations of others. Muslims returned to their mosques. Jews, long barred from the city, were invited back to pray once more. Holy sites were preserved, not destroyed. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained untouched. Saladin did not rule with vengeance. He ruled with vision. This moment, so rare in the chronicles of war, would become legend, not for the bloodshed it avoided, but for the mercy it made real. Jerusalem, sacred to three faiths, breathed again not in screams, but in silence. Pilgrims came, prayers rose, and peace, for a moment, returned to a city often caught between swords. Legacy of the Lionheart. Yet peace, like breath, is often brief. In Europe, the fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through kingdoms and courts. A new crusade was called the Third, and at its head stood one of the most famous kings of the medieval world, Richard the Lionheart. Strong, bold, and brilliant in battle, Richard arrived in the Holy Land in 1191. What followed was a war not of slaughtered cities, but of sieges, skirmishes, and standoff. Richard recaptured Acre. He fought Saladin at Arsuf, a clash of equals beneath a searing sky. But though victories were won on both sides, Jerusalem remained out of reach. Saladin, ever patient, refused to allow it to fall again. Richard, despite his strength, could not take it by force. And so, after months of campaigning, letters passed between them, words, not weapons. Their relationship was marked by mutual respect. Each man saw in the other something rare. Not only a warrior, but a leader. They exchanged gifts. They spared prisoners. And in 1192 they made peace. Richard would return to England. Saladin would hold Jerusalem. But Christian pilgrims would be allowed to visit the city freely, protected by the very man who had once taken it in war. Saladin died the next year. He left no great treasure. His empire would fragment after his death. But what he left behind could not be measured in gold or land. He left behind a memory, a whisper, a standard of conduct in war, rare and radiant. In the West, he became a symbol of chivalry, a Muslim hero revered even by Christian knights. In the East, he remained a figure of faith and fairness, one who restored dignity to his people not through domination, but through discipline. The wars he fought reshaped the map, but his legacy reshaped the heart. Across time, the name Saladin is spoken not with fear, but with awe. He changed the world not by conquering it, but by showing what it could be when guided by justice. Chapter 7. The Fall of Constantinople. The year was 1453. Spring had barely unfurled its green banners across Europe, and yet at the edge of two worlds, East and West, something far older was coming undone. Constantinople, once the proud jewel of the Roman and Byzantine world, stood like an old soldier at the end of his watch. Worn, weathered, but still refusing to bow. Its golden domes shimmered in the morning light, but the city was tired. For centuries, it had been a crossroads of faith, of empire, of trade and power. Now it stood alone, surrounded not by allies, but by a rising tide of ambition. Mem II was not yet 22, young in years but aged in vision. They called him the Conqueror, not yet in truth, but in determination. His heart beat with the fire of a dream long carried by the Ottoman sultans before him, to claim the city that had defied them all. Unlike the crusaders or kings who had passed before him, Mehmed brought with him not just soldiers, but something new, something terrible. Gunpowder, and cannons so large that they seemed like dragons made of iron. He stood before the mighty Theodosian walls, the triple-layered stone defense that had kept armies at bay for 1,000 years. These were not simple defenses. They were stories set in stone, battlements so high and deep that even nature seemed to yield. But Mehmed did not see the past. He saw what could be. A new Rome, a new center, not for emperors in purple robes, but for sultans in silk and steel. He encircled the city with his troops, numbering in the tens of thousands. His navy blocked the Bosporus. The siege began not with a shout, but with silence, a kind of heavy, waiting silence, as if the earth itself held its breath. Cannons at the gate. Then came the thunder. For weeks, the city trembled beneath the roar of Mem's great cannons. They were unlike anything the world had seen. Cast in bronze, dragged by teams of oxen, each shot shaking the ground like an earthquake. Walls that had held back centuries of enemies now began to crack. Every sunrise brought new holes in the defenses, and every night the Byzantines patched what they could with rubble and faith. Inside the city, fear lived in every breath. Constantinople's people, once used to the sounds of bells and market stalls, now woke to the sound of stone crashing against stone. But they did not surrender. The Emperor, Constantine XI, stood at the walls himself, not as a ruler above the people, but beside them. He wore armor. He prayed. He fought. He knew the odds, and still he chose to stand. From the sea, the Ottoman fleet pressed tighter, closing any hope of supplies or reinforcements. And yet, despite the cannons, despite the hunger, despite the crumbling walls, the city held. Day after day, week after week, as the tulips bloomed in the fields beyond, the city refused to fall. But technology was shifting the world. The age of castles and swords was fading. This was the dawn of cannon fire and empire. No wall could stand forever against it. By late May, a final breach opened. The Ottomans were ready. The walls that had stood for more than a millennium were now pitted and weak. The defenders, brave but outnumbered, clung to their posts with worn hands and broken shields. The night before the final assault, the stars hung silently over the city, as if they too knew what was coming. A last mass, and then there was the church. Before dawn, before the gates fell and the horns of war sounded, the people of Constantinople gathered one last time in Hagia Sophia. Once a cathedral, then a mosque, then a cathedral again, it was the soul of the city. Its domes echoed with the voices of emperors and saints. Now it held the whispers of a people about to pass into legend. They came with candles, with tears, with silence. Rich and poor, soldier and child. No more politics, no more borders, just hearts bound by fear and faith. Priests led the final liturgy in Greek and Latin, incense rising like smoke from a dying fire. Some wept, others stood still, faces turned upward toward the golden mosaics that seemed to glow brighter in those final hours. It was not a service of victory. It was a farewell, a prayer not for survival but for memory. In that moment, beneath the great dome of Hagia Sophia, something eternal stirred. The past spoke softly to the future. The chants of that final mass echoed down stone corridors, carried by dust and time. Even as the city braced for its end, the people clung to something beyond walls and weapons. They clung to soul. Outside, the cannons grew quiet, not from mercy, but from readiness. Mem's army stood like shadows waiting for dawn, and when the sky began to pale, they moved. From Rome to Istanbul, the walls broke. The Ottomans poured in. They came with fury, with discipline, with purpose. The defenders fought, but they were few. Emperor Constantine XI, sword in hand, vanished into the fray. No one ever found his body. Some say he died as a common soldier. Others say he became legend. The streets of Constantinople ran with fire and noise. Homes were emptied, churches were stripped, bells were silenced. But only for a moment. Mehmed entered the city not with blind destruction, but with vision. He rode to Hagia Sophia, dismounted, and stepped beneath its dome. He ordered the church be turned into a mosque, not destroyed. He saw not just a prize, but a future. And so the city changed. From Constantinople, it became Istanbul. From Byzantine, it became Ottoman. From the last outpost of Rome, it became the heart of a new empire. Mehmed declared it his capital. He repaired the walls, restored the streets, and invited people back, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and others, to live and work and worship. The city breathed again under a different sky, but something of the old world remained. You can still feel it in the stones, in the quiet courtyards where once monks walked, in the arches that bend not just to Mecca, but to memory. The fall of Constantinople was not just an ending. It was a hinge in history, The Middle Ages were closing. The Renaissance was beginning. Trade routes shifted. Scholars fled west, bringing ancient Greek texts to Europe's universities. The very idea of East and West would never be the same again. And yet, in the heart of the night, when the Bosphorus waters ripple softly under moonlight, you can still hear the echoes of chants, of cannons, of footsteps crossing from one age into another. Chapter 8: The Age of Steam and Steel. The world had begun to hum, not with birdsong or the chatter of crowded streets, but with something new, something colder. It was the low, relentless roar of steam pushing through iron engines, the crackle of wires stretching across continents, and the clang of factories where men and machines labored side by side. The age of steam had arrived. The age of steel had followed closely behind, and together they were changing everything. Trains carved through the land like sharp blades. No longer did it take weeks to cross a country, it took days, sometimes hours. With every rail laid, empires grew bolder. Tracks became arteries, pumping people, goods, and armies through the heart of growing nations. Telegraph wires followed, whispering across great distances. Messages that once traveled on horseback now moved at the speed of electricity, tying distant corners of empires to their capitals in ways never seen before. The rifle, too, had transformed. No longer the slow, smoky tool of an uncertain battlefield, it became fast, precise, and deadly. Industrial factories did not just build cities, they built war. Soldiers no longer wore bright colors to stand proud. They wore earth tones to vanish. Battles became more brutal, more distant, more impersonal. The new wars were not of knights and swords, but of gears, gas, and gunpowder. And those who held the machines, the British, the French, the Germans, the Americans, now held power like no empire had before. They did not just conquer land. They reshaped the map with rulers made of iron, pens filled with ink made from coal smoke and ambition. The world, once vast and mysterious, was being pressed into something new. A system of control, fastened with steel and run by steam. Across Europe, nations no longer dreamed of defense. They dreamed of dominance. If a rival could build more, move faster, shoot farther, that was cause for fear. Factories turned not just to profit but to preparation. Coal-fed furnaces worked through the night, building not only trains and tools, but warships, cannons, and rifles by the millions. In just a few decades, empires became machines, each with pistons of policy and engines of expansion. But this wasn't only about Europe. This new machinery of empire needed fuel. Not just coal or iron, but people, land, and resources. And the empires knew where to find them. Africa divided, Asia targeted. It began with maps, empty to some eyes, though full of life for centuries. In quiet chambers and royal salons, European powers drew lines across Africa and Asia. Bold, clean lines that ignored mountains, rivers, and lives. These were not borders. They were claims. Stakes driven into the ground by those who saw only what could be taken. Africa, with its gold, rubber, ivory, and labor, became a target too tempting to ignore. What followed would be called the Scramble for Africa. In the late 1800s, European nations, led by Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, and Portugal, raced to carve up the continent. They did not ask the people. They did not consult the kingdoms. With steel rails and steamships, they arrived and took. In Berlin, 1884, a conference was held. Not in Africa, not by Africans, but by men with maps and ambitions. They divided the continent like slices of bread. Congo for Belgium, Sudan for Britain, Algeria for France. The justifications were wrapped in the language of progress. Bringing civilization, they said, but the truth was in the factories. The empire needed raw material and Africa would provide it. In Asia, the gaze was no softer. India, once ruled by local kings and the Mughal emperors, had long been under British control. But now, industrial empires were hungrier. They looked to China, to Southeast Asia, to the Pacific Islands. The Opium Wars had already cracked open China's doors, letting foreign powers into trade and to rule. Japan, once isolated, had watched with sharp eyes. It saw what happened to those who resisted the steam and steel. And so, Japan chose a different path, to modernize fast and fiercely. In less than half a century, it transformed from a feudal society into an industrial military power. It built railways, telegraphs, ships, and soon it too would join the game of empire. But while maps were redrawn in European halls on the ground, the story was different. For every treaty signed in ink, there was blood spilled beneath it. Not all would be conquered so quietly. Voices of resistance. In the shadow of factories and forts, something stirred, soft at first, like wind through tall grass, but growing louder. In the villages of India, among the plains of Algeria, deep in the forests of Congo, people began to resist. In 1857, India saw a spark. Soldiers in the British Army, Indian men called sepoys, rose up in what became known as the First War of Independence. It was fierce and chaotic, driven by anger, faith, and dignity. Though the rebellion was crushed, it shook the empire. The British Crown took direct control of India after that, fearing what might come next. In Algeria, French colonizers met constant rebellion. From tribes in the mountains to voices in the cities, resistance simmered. In Sudan, a man named Muhammad Ahmad declared himself the Mahdi, a chosen one, and led a revolt against Anglo-Egyptian rule. For a time, he won. Khartoum fell. The British retreated. Though they would return years later, the echo of his movement did not fade. Across Africa and Asia, stories repeated. Of kings resisting, of farmers refusing, of teachers and poets spreading dreams of freedom. They had no steamships, no telegraphs, no factories, but they had something else: memory, faith, and fire. In Vietnam, resistance brewed beneath the surface of French control. In China, the Boxer Rebellion erupted, a furious answer to foreign domination. Even in the Americas, voices rose. Though no longer colonies, many lands still felt the grip of empire in their economies, in their borders, in their names. And still, the world turned faster. Trains raced, ships steamed, guns clicked into place. The age of resistance had begun, but it was being drowned, slowly, by a rising sea of power, one that could not be stopped forever. Something deeper, darker was building, powder in the air. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had become a machine wound too tight. Every empire was expanding. Every nation was arming. Alliances formed, webs of promise and threat. Germany and Austria-Hungary stood together. France and Russia matched them. Britain, once aloof, joined hands with old rivals out of fear of new ones. Like dominoes balanced on edge, all it would take was one push. And the signs were there, small sparks that never quite caught but always smoldered. The Balkan Wars shook Europe's southeastern edge. Germany built dreadnoughts to match Britain's fleet. France dug trenches before war even began. Everywhere, people waited, not with peace, but with preparation. The skies were quiet, but the silence felt heavy. Factories ran day and night. Uniforms were sewn. Maps were studied not by explorers, but by generals. The air itself felt brittle, like glass before a storm. Then, in a quiet city called Sarajevo in the summer of 1914, a shot was fired. A young man pulled a trigger. A royal fell, and the machine that had been building for decades, the machine of empire, steel, steam, pride, and powder, finally roared to life. The war that followed would tear the world open. But that is a story for another night. Chapter 9, The Great War. It began with a single shot, sharp, sudden, and almost forgotten by the echoing streets of Sarajevo. June 28, 1914. A warm day in the heart of Bosnia, and Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, rode through the city in an open car. With him was his wife, Sophie. They were smiling. The crowd was mixed, some quiet, some curious, a few hostile. And then, from the edge of the road, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip stepped forward. He raised a pistol aimed at the royal pair and pulled the trigger. 2 lives ended. But the war, the one that would be called great only because of how deeply it hurt the world, had just begun. Europe was already dry wood, stacked and ready. The empires had spent decades building alliances like trap wires, tight, tense, and waiting for a stumble. Austria-Hungary, wounded and angry, blamed Serbia. Germany stood with Austria. Russia stood with Serbia. France stood with Russia. Britain watched, worried, but bound to Belgium. One by one, the dominoes tipped. Within weeks, what might have been a regional feud had grown into a global wildfire. It was not just about alliances. It was pride. It was fear. It was the belief, so terribly wrong, that the war would be short. Soldiers marched through cities with flowers on their rifles and songs on their lips, believing they'd be home by Christmas. But the avalanche had started, and no one could stop it now. Not kings, not generals, not reason, and certainly not hope. Trenches and gas. What followed was not a war of swift victory, but a nightmare stretched across years. On the Western Front, from the coasts of Belgium to the borders of Switzerland, trenches carved into the earth like wounds. Miles of mud, wire, and despair. Soldiers dug in and stayed, not for days but for months, then for years. The ground swallowed them, and the war above them changed everything. The rifle was no longer enough. Machine guns sprayed death in arcs. Artillery shells thundered overhead, falling like hammers on soft ground. But perhaps the most terrifying of all was the gas. Chlorine, mustard, invisible killers. The wind could betray a man, and a breath could end him. Faces blistered, lungs burned, eyes went blind. The gas mask became a second skin, but even then, it was never safe. There was no dignity in this kind of war, no honor, no glory, only survival. Life in the trenches was a slow kind of dying. Water pooled at their feet. Rats fed on the dead. Sleep was rare. Letters home were written with trembling hands, sometimes by candlelight, often in silence. And yet, in that silence, the war groaned on. Battles with names like the Somme and Verdun became symbols of futility. Thousands died for yards of earth. One step forward, then 10 steps back. On the Eastern Front, the war moved more quickly but not more kindly. The Russians suffered staggering losses. The cold was merciless. Supplies ran thin. And in the background, something was breaking inside Russia. A quiet cracking of an empire, waiting to fall. The collapse of old orders. By the time the war reached its final years, the world that had started it was already unrecognizable. The empires that once loomed over Europe like mountains were crumbling into dust. Austria-Hungary, a patchwork of peoples and languages held together by tradition and threat, began to tear at the seams. National groups long buried under imperial rule saw a chance for freedom. Hungary pulled one way, Czechs another. The empire had stretched too far, too long. Now it broke. The Ottoman Empire, already worn and weakened, found itself fighting on many fronts, from the deserts of Arabia to the snows of the Caucasus. The British stirred rebellion in its Arab provinces, promising independence that would later be betrayed. In the end, the empire that had stood for 6 centuries fell into silence, its heart carved up by foreign powers. And in Russia, the greatest fall of all, the people rose, tired of the war, the hunger, and the Tsar who seemed deaf to their pain. They revolted. In 1917, revolution swept through the streets of Petrograd. The Romanovs were swept aside. A new force, the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin, promised peace, land, and bread. They would leave the war, sign a harsh treaty with Germany, and turn inward, toward a future both feared and uncertain. The kings and emperors who had led their nations into battle were gone. Some dead, some in exile. The age of empire had cracked, and what came after would not be built on crowns, but on chaos. The treaty that wasn't peace. By November 1918, the guns fell quiet. Germany, its people weary and starving, agreed to an armistice. The war was over, or so the world hoped. But peace, true peace, would prove harder than victory. In 1919, leaders gathered at Versailles. They came to build a new order, to ensure this kind of war would never happen again. But the room was filled with anger, with grief, and with blame. France wanted revenge. Britain wanted balance. The United States, led by Woodrow Wilson, wanted ideals, a League of Nations, a new way forward. but ideals drowned in the tide of resentment. Germany was not invited to speak. Instead, they were handed terms: loss of land, limits on their military, and a crushing debt in reparations. The treaty was signed, but it felt more like punishment than promise. German leaders called it a diktat, an order, not a choice. And deep in the wounded pride of a nation, seeds were planted, not of peace, but of something darker. All around the world, lines were redrawn. New nations were born, often without asking those who lived there. In the Middle East, the broken promises to Arabs turned into bitterness. In Eastern Europe, fragile states tried to stand on the ruins of old empires. And in Germany, humiliated, cornered, angry, a quiet storm was forming. It would take just 20 years for that storm to return. The Great War had ended, but its shadow was long, and the world would walk in it again. Chapter 10: The World at War Again. In the quiet years after the First World War, the world tried to breathe again. But the peace was shallow, fragile. A thin sheet of ice over a restless lake. Beneath it, pain brewed. Germany, humiliated and broken by the Treaty of Versailles, carried wounds too deep to ignore. Inflation devoured its money, and pride had become a memory. Out of this bitter soil, a new voice rose, loud, angry, and full of promises. His name was Adolf Hitler. He spoke of strength, of renewal, of revenge. And people listened. In Japan, too, a storm had gathered. As Europe reeled from its own troubles, Japan grew bold in the east. It seized Manchuria, invaded China, and told itself it was building an empire. The world watched, concerned but silent. Democracies, still tired from the last war, hoped these fires would burn out on their own. But fires left alone do not go out. They spread. By the late 1930s, Hitler had broken nearly every rule. He rearmed Germany. He marched into Austria. He demanded land from Czechoslovakia and got it. Britain and France, afraid of another war, gave in again and again. They called it appeasement. But to Hitler, it was proof. No one would stop him. Then came September 1st, 1939. German tanks rolled into Poland. Within days, Britain and France declared war. The world was at war again, and this time it would be total. In Blitzkrieg, lightning war, the Nazis stormed across Europe. Poland fell. Then Denmark and Norway. Then France in just 6 weeks. Hitler seemed unstoppable. In Asia, Japan's conquests grew more brutal. Cities were burned. Civilians slaughtered. By the early 1940s, darkness stretched across continents. And yet, the United States remained on the sidelines. It watched, supplied, and debated. But on December 7, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. America could no longer stay out. The war became truly global, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, from the icy steppes of Russia to the beaches of the Pacific. Every ocean, every continent, every sky turned to war, the Holocaust and the bomb. While armies clashed across borders, deeper terrors unfolded in silence. Out of sight, behind barbed wire and brick walls. The Holocaust was not a battle. It was a slow, planned horror. As the Nazis expanded, they brought with them something far darker than tanks or guns. They brought a plan to erase a people. Jews were hunted, herded, and marked. Trains carried them to camps, places with names the world would one day shudder to hear: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. Families were separated. Heads were shaved. Identities were stripped. And behind guarded fences, beneath smokestacks that never stopped, more than 6 million were murdered, simply for being who they were. But it wasn't only Jews. Roma people, disabled children, political enemies, gay men. Anyone outside the Nazis' twisted view of perfection became a target. It was hatred organized into factories of death. The world did not see, or chose not to see, the full scale of it until it was too late. Soldiers, when they finally reached the camps, wept. War is cruel, but what they found there was not war. It was evil, systematic, and cold. And yet, as the slow horror unfolded in Europe, another storm brewed far away. This one fast, secret, and blinding. In the deserts of New Mexico, under code names and guarded skies, American scientists raced to unlock the atom. It was a gamble, one that could change everything. They called it the Manhattan Project. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb was tested. The sky turned to fire, the earth trembled, and human power reached a terrifying new height. A month later, with the war in Europe over and Japan refusing to surrender, President Harry Truman made a choice. On August 6th, the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. In seconds, the city vanished. 3 days later, Nagasaki was next. The world had seen many horrors, but now it had seen one that could end everything. D-Day and destruction. For years, Hitler's grip on Europe had held firm. The Nazis controlled vast lands, guarded by bunkers, barbed wire, and blood. But behind closed doors, a new plan was forming, one that would change the tide. It was called Operation Overlord. On June 6, 1944, as night gave way to dawn, thousands of ships appeared in the English Channel. Planes buzzed overhead. Paratroopers dropped into fields under cover of dark. And at the beaches of Normandy, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, Allied forces stormed ashore. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history. The beaches were death traps. Machine guns rained down from the cliffs. Sand turned red, but still they came. Americans, British, Canadians. Inch by inch, yard by yard, they pushed forward. By nightfall, the beaches were held. And from there, the liberation of Europe began. Paris was freed. Belgium was retaken. And as the Allies closed in from the west, the Soviets pushed from the east, crushing German forces in bitter, bloody battles. But the cost was vast. Cities burned. Homes collapsed. Millions were dead or wounded. Bombs fell like rain over London, Berlin, Dresden, Tokyo. The skies were never quiet. The nights, never safe. The war was not only fought with bullets, but with hunger, fear, and loss. In Eastern Europe, civilians fled the fighting, only to find new masters or deeper graves. In Asia, whole villages vanished. Rape, starvation, slavery, these were not accidents. They were tools. And yet, from that darkness, some light began to glimmer. The Nazis, once invincible, were crumbling. Japan, pushed back island by island, grew desperate. The world, though broken, was beginning to resist the weight of tyranny. A divided planet. In May 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. The cities were rubble, its leader gone. Flags were raised over ruins. Tears fell into dust. But peace, real peace, remained distant. Japan still fought on, though its defeat was near. And then, in August, the bombs fell. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, fire that blinded the sky. Within days, Japan surrendered. The Second World War was over. Nearly 80 million people had died. And yet, even in the silence that followed, a new tension was already beginning. The Allies had won, but they were no longer united. The United States and the Soviet Union, once uneasy partners, now stood face to face. One believed in freedom and markets, the other in control and communism. They had beaten Hitler together, but now they looked at each other as rivals. Germany was split in two. So was Europe. An iron curtain, as Churchill called it, fell across the continent. The Cold War had begun. Nations picked sides. The world was no longer at war, but it was not at peace. New weapons loomed. New fears rose. The shadow of the bomb, once used, now multiplied, hung over every decision. But something else emerged, too. The United Nations was born. Countries, for the first time, came together to try not to conquer, but to talk. Trials were held to judge the crimes of the Holocaust. The word genocide was born, because the world had finally seen what it meant. Old empires collapsed. Colonies demanded freedom. India, Indonesia, Africa. A new world was coming, shaped by pain but also by hope. The war had shattered the earth, but from its broken pieces, people began to rebuild, to promise softly never again. And though the scars remain, and the lessons still echo, so too does the courage of those who stood up, not just to fight, but to remember. Chapter 11: Cold Wars and Quiet Battles. In the wake of World War II, the world did not rest. Though the great battlefields had gone quiet, a new kind of war took shape, one without bullets in the open, but with fear humming through every radio, every headline, every heartbeat. Two nations emerged as giants in a fragile new world: the United States and the Soviet Union. Their flags flew high, their ideals even higher: capitalism and democracy on one side, communism and control on the other. But behind the banners were shadows. Both had power that could reshape the earth, yet neither dared to fully use it. So they watched each other, waited, and prepared. The Cold War was not a war in the traditional sense. It was a long and silent standoff, a chess match played with spies instead of knights, with propaganda instead of swords. Across oceans and continents, the globe was quietly divided. Western Europe leaned toward the United States, drawn in by rebuilding efforts like the Marshall Plan and promises of liberty. Eastern Europe, in contrast, fell behind what Winston Churchill would call the Iron Curtain, sealed into the Soviet sphere, where fear and secrecy thickened like mist. There was no single battlefield. The Cold War stretched across minds, schools, and television sets. It lived in whispers behind closed doors, in coded messages passed between agents, in silent satellites gliding above the earth. It was a war of tension, where the loudest noise was the quiet hum of anxiety, always present. The world held its breath, not knowing whether the next dawn would bring peace or the flash of something final. The United States built alliances like NATO to defend the West. The Soviet Union built its own with the Warsaw Pact, holding its grip over Eastern Europe. From Berlin to Beijing, the world became a line of dominoes, each one waiting to fall to one side or the other. There were no marching bands or grand declarations, but there was always movement, always a sense that the air was heavy, that one wrong move could tip the world. And so, this new era began, not with an explosion, but with silence. Proxy wars. Though the United States and the Soviet Union never fired missiles at each other directly, their conflict spilled across the world in what came to be known as proxy wars, battles fought in distant lands where others would bleed in their place. In Korea, the first great clash came. The North, backed by the Soviets and later China, surged across the 38th parallel, hoping to unify the peninsula under communism. The South, with the help of U.S. troops and United Nations forces, pushed back. For 3 long years, the land seesawed between frozen hills and muddy fields. Cities were shattered, families divided, and when it ended in 1953, the line between North and South stood roughly where it had begun, but with millions dead and a new chill in the air. Then came Vietnam. At first, it was a French colonial struggle, but as the decades turned, it became something else entirely. The United States, determined to stop the dominoes from falling to communism in Southeast Asia, sent troops and helicopters, bombs and dollars. The Viet Cong, supported by North Vietnam and backed in part by the Soviets and Chinese, fought back with fierce determination. Jungle warfare, napalm, and guerrilla tactics turned the land into a burning maze of suffering. It was a war fought not only with bullets, but with hearts and minds, a war that slowly wore down a generation. Meanwhile, in places like Angola and Nicaragua, civil wars became theaters for Cold War rivalry. Each superpower supplied weapons, advisors, and money, not for peace but to make sure the other didn't win. In Afghanistan, the Soviet Union invaded in 1979, trying to hold a communist government in place. The United States, through the CIA, supported local resistance fighters called the Mujahideen. It became a war of attrition in the mountains, a haunting echo of earlier empires lost to Afghan soil. Everywhere the Cold War touched, it left scars, not always visible but deep. In villages that never knew what capitalism or communism meant, lives were torn apart by distant ideologies. And while the superpowers never met in open battle, their shadows danced in every corner of the map. Mutually assured destruction. There was something else that kept the Cold War from igniting into full-scale war. Something terrifying and strangely stabilizing. It was called mutually assured destruction, often shortened to MAD. A simple, chilling idea. If either side launched its nuclear weapons, the other would respond with equal force. And both would be destroyed. Completely. By the early 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union had built enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over. These were not just bombs, they were city-leveling devices, weapons that could flatten entire nations in seconds. They were kept in underground silos, in submarines lurking in oceans, in planes always ready to fly. Day and night, they waited, guarded by codes and humans who knew the cost of a mistake. In 1962, the world came closer than ever to disaster. It was called the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union had secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast. When American planes spotted them, the reaction was swift. President John F. Kennedy demanded their removal, and for 13 tense days, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war. People prayed. Leaders calculated. In schools, children practiced hiding under desks, though deep down, everyone knew a desk would not save them. At last, a deal was made. The Soviets removed their missiles, and the U.S. quietly agreed to remove some of its own from Turkey. The moment passed, but the fear never fully left. From that point on, deterrence became doctrine. Both sides agreed that the best way to prevent war was to make it unthinkable. Treaties were signed to limit weapons, but both nations kept building. Just in case. The logic was strange, to keep peace by preparing for the end of everything. And yet, somehow, it worked. The missiles remained in their silos. The submarines stayed beneath the sea. And the world, though tense and weary, kept turning. Cracks in the curtain. For decades, the Soviet Union held its grip on Eastern Europe with iron hands, controlling speech, movement, and thought. But under the surface, pressure grew. People longed for freedom, for truth, for something more than silence and fear. The first cracks came from voices. In places like Poland, workers and priests began to speak out. The Solidarity movement, led by an electrician named Lech Walesa, demanded change, not with guns, but with strikes and protests. The government tried to silence them, but the message had already spread. People were watching. People were listening. In Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and East Germany, whispers turned into roars. Radio waves from the West carried news, music, and hope. People began to question what they were told. Underground newspapers circulated. Young people gathered in quiet defiance. The Iron Curtain that had once seemed unbreakable began to rust. Inside the Soviet Union, a new leader rose, Mikhail Gorbachev. He brought new ideas, glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning reform. He spoke of change, of a future where people could speak freely, where the government could work for the people. It was a bold shift, but once the door was open, it could not be closed. In 1989, the unthinkable happened. The Berlin Wall, that symbol of division and despair, came crashing down. People from East and West embraced, danced, cried. For decades, the wall had divided a city, a continent, a world. Now it was just stone and dust beneath their feet. One by one, communist governments across Eastern Europe fell. Some with violence, others with peaceful marches and candlelight vigils. And in 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, not with a bomb, but with a signature. The Cold War was over, but its echoes still linger. In alliances, in old scars, in the cautious gaze of nations. It was a war not won with armies, but with time, voices, and resilience. And though it was called cold, it touched the hearts of millions with quiet fire. Chapter 12, The Collapse of Empires. In the cold November air of 1989, something quiet began to stir in Berlin. Not the roar of armies or the grind of tanks, but footsteps, voices, and the soft clatter of tools against stone. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall had stood like a scar across a city and a world, dividing not just East from West, but hope from fear, freedom from silence. Built by the German Democratic Republic in 1961, it was more than concrete. It was a barrier of ideology forged by the tensions of the Cold War. And yet, by the late 1980s, cracks began to show, not in the structure itself, but in the system it upheld. Across Eastern Europe, people were rising. In Poland, workers demanded change. In Hungary, fences came down. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution bloomed. As pressure built, East Germans began to flee through neighboring countries, seeking the West not through force, but through persistence. The world watched as governments, once rigid, began to bend. Then came the night, November 9th, 1989. Confusion, a misstatement in a press conference, and a chain of human yearning all converged. Border guards, unsure and overwhelmed, opened the gates. Crowds gathered. Strangers embraced. People climbed the wall, chipped at it, danced on it. East met West not with violence, but with awe. Families reunited. Streets overflowed with laughter, with tears. And beneath all of it was the quiet sound of something larger collapsing, the symbolic end of the Cold War and the beginning of a new chapter for Europe. Yet the fall of the Berlin Wall wasn't just a local event. It sent ripples around the world. It marked the fading of an era where the globe had been split into two ideological camps. The Iron Curtain had lifted, and with it came dreams of unity, of democracy, of something freer than what had been before. But like all turning points in history, the promise came with uncertainty. What lay ahead would be shaped not only by the joy of that night, but by the struggles that followed. Africa and the ghosts of colonies. While Europe reunited, Africa was still healing from wounds left by centuries of imperial rule. Throughout the mid to late 20th century, one nation after another had stepped out from under colonial shadows. Flags were changed, anthems rewritten, and governments born from the will of native people. Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Angola, names once spoken in the language of empires now stood proud on their own terms. But independence, though long fought for, brought a path that was not always straight. Borders had been drawn by distant hands, cutting across tribes, languages, and ancient ways of life. When colonial powers withdrew, they often left behind fragile institutions, divided communities, and economic systems built to serve outsiders. The result was a wave of instability that swept across the continent like a storm. In Nigeria, civil war erupted in the late 1960s as the Biafran region tried to break away. The images of starving children and shattered villages stunned the world. In Rwanda, the ghosts of colonial favoritism festered into genocide in 1994, when neighbor turned against neighbor in 100 Days of Horror. In the Congo, rich in minerals and haunted by colonial cruelty, chaos became a cruel routine. And yet, amid all this, something else stirred: resilience. From the ashes of conflict came leaders who dared to dream. Some rebuilt roads, others rebuilt peace. In places like South Africa, where apartheid reigned for decades, the fall of colonialism's racial legacy led to democratic triumphs. Nelson Mandela, once a prisoner, emerged as a symbol of unity, guiding a nation toward hope. Africa's story after empire was not one of simple victory or failure. It was, and remains, a story of struggle, identity, and rebirth. The continent carried the weight of history, yes, but also the seeds of something bold. As the 20th century neared its end, Africa reminded the world that freedom alone was not enough. It had to be nurtured, defended, and made real for all. The end of the USSR. Far to the north and east, another giant was beginning to stagger. The Soviet Union, once a colossus that spanned 11 time zones and ruled through steel and fear, was unraveling. The end, though sudden in the headlines, had long been in motion. Behind the polished parades and red banners were deep cracks. A failing economy, weary citizens, and a system straining under its own weight. In the 1980s, a new leader emerged, Mikhail Gorbachev. He promised openness, reform, and a break from the past. His policies, glasnost and perestroika, were meant to breathe life into a tired nation. But instead of renewal, they unleashed forces that could not be controlled. People spoke more freely. Republics began to question Moscow's rule. Old national identities, long suppressed, rose like waves. Then, in 1991, it happened. One by one, the republics declared independence: Ukraine, Lithuania, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and many more. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned. The red flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union, which had once challenged the West for global supremacy, dissolved into 15 separate nations, each with its own dreams, its own wounds, its own uncertain path. For many, the fall brought freedom, a chance to speak, to vote, to dream without fear. But it also brought hardship. The economic shock was severe. Inflation soared. Jobs vanished. In Russia, once the heart of the empire, a new era began, one marked by change, by struggle, and by questions that still echo today. The end of the USSR reshaped the world. The Cold War was over. The globe was no longer divided by red and blue, by capitalism and communism. But the peace that followed was not perfect. New rivalries, new tensions, new battles of influence would arise. Still, the moment was historic. The peaceful end of an empire that had once terrified and fascinated the modern world. A new global order? With empires gone and ideologies broken, the world entered a new age. For a moment, it seemed as though democracy had triumphed, that globalization would bring peace and progress. Borders were redrawn, economies opened, technology connected once distant lands. It was, some said, the end of history, a time when liberal democracy would reign unchallenged. But the 21st century had other plans. Old tensions did not disappear. They evolved. Nationalism returned, dressed in new clothes. In places once united by empire, divisions deepened again. The Balkans, no longer under Yugoslavia's grip, erupted in ethnic wars. In the Middle East, conflicts flared that traced roots to colonial lines and Cold War choices. At the same time, new challenges arose, not of land, but of networks and ideas. Terrorism crossed borders without armies. Climate change ignored treaties and time zones. Economic crashes in one country shook markets across oceans. And as democracy spread, so too did doubt. Authoritarianism, once seen as fading, found new life in many corners of the globe. The collapse of empires did not lead to a single order. Instead, it opened a world of possibilities and risks. In Europe, the European Union tried to unite what war had once torn apart. In Africa, new voices demanded not just independence, but dignity. In Asia, rising powers shifted the balance of the world stage. And across every continent, people asked the same question in different tongues. What comes next? The answer remains unwritten, but perhaps, in the silence after empires, there is a chance to listen to the lessons of the past, to the hopes of the present, to the soft, steady beat of something new being born. A world not ruled but shared, not conquered but connected. And so the great walls fell, the flags changed, the empires, once mighty, faded into history's long sleep. But in their place rose something quieter, not yet complete, but full of promise. A world forever changed by the sound of falling empires. Chapter 13. September's Shattered Skies. The morning of September 11th, 2001, began like any other. The sky over New York City was clear, brushed in soft blues and golden light. People sipped coffee on their way to work. Children walked to school with backpacks too big for their small shoulders. In the heart of Manhattan, the twin towers of the World Trade Center stood tall, silver, silent, still. But within minutes, the air would shift. At 8:46 a.m., the first plane hit the North Tower. The sound shattered the morning calm. A gash opened in the side of the building, fire and smoke pouring into the sky like a wound that could not heal. At first, many did not believe what they were seeing. Some thought it was an accident, a terrible mistake. But 17 minutes later, when the second plane struck the South Tower at 9:03 a.m., all doubt vanished. It was not an accident. It was an attack. News anchors choked on their words. Pedestrians screamed or stood frozen. Sirens wailed as first responders rushed toward the chaos, running up stairwells while others fled down. The towers burned, visible from miles away. People on the ground looked up with hands over their mouths, as thick smoke curled into the bright blue sky. Then, at 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. Not slowly, not gently, but in a terrifying rush. A wave of dust, glass, and steel spilled into the streets like a tidal surge. Moments later, at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower followed. Nearly 3,000 people died that day. Mothers, fathers, firefighters, office workers, and strangers helping strangers. In Washington, another plane struck the Pentagon. In Pennsylvania, passengers on Flight 93 fought back against hijackers, crashing the plane into a field to stop further destruction. For hours, the world held its breath, eyes locked on televisions. Smoke rose where skyscrapers once stood. Ash drifted like snow, and in the silence that followed, the world would never be the same again. It was a new kind of war, one not declared by nations, but by shadows. One that made even the most powerful country feel small, exposed, and afraid. September 11th did not just take lives. It took the sense of safety, the idea that oceans could shield or that borders could protect. In a single morning, the 21st century was born, not with celebration, but with collapse. Afghanistan and Iraq. Just weeks after the dust had settled over New York, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom. The target, Afghanistan. This war was not about conquering land. It was about uprooting a network, about finding the men behind the attacks. Chief among them was Osama bin Laden, the face of al-Qaeda. The Taliban government in Afghanistan, which sheltered al-Qaeda, became the first focus. Bombs fell on Kabul. American forces advanced through deserts and mountains, fighting an enemy that did not wear uniforms, that did not hold ground, but moved like smoke through caves and villages. First, it seemed clear. Strike back. Remove the threat. But quickly, the war grew tangled. Years passed. Soldiers rotated in and out. Governments rose and fell. The mission shifted from retaliation to reconstruction, then to survival. Afghanistan became a mirror, reflecting all the complexities of fighting an idea with weapons. Then, in 2003, attention turned to Iraq. The reasons were different, at least on paper. Weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein. A threat, officials said, too great to ignore. So the bombs fell again, this time on Baghdad. The shock and awe campaign lit up the night sky like a violent sunrise. American tanks rolled through the ancient land of Mesopotamia. Statues toppled. The regime crumbled. But peace did not follow. Iraq became a battlefield not just of armies, but of identities. Sectarian violence flared. Insurgents rose from the ashes. Roadside bombs and suicide attacks became part of daily life. American soldiers found themselves caught in a storm of endless conflict, where progress was hard to measure and safety could vanish in a moment. Both wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, stretched on longer than anyone imagined. What was meant to be swift became endless. Trillions were spent. Lives were lost. Not just soldiers, but civilians, families, children who had never heard of 9/11. And still, the fires of conflict burned. These wars were not like the ones of the past. There were no victory parades, no treaties signed on battleships. There was only the long, aching march forward, uncertain, heavy, and without a clear end. Terror without borders. Terrorism changed after 2001. It no longer needed a headquarters. It no longer wore a face. With the rise of the internet and digital communication, it became scattered, like sparks carried by wind. Al-Qaeda was just the beginning. Other groups rose from the cracks. In Iraq, ISIS, the Islamic State, grew like a storm, captured cities, declared a caliphate, and used fear as a weapon more powerful than bombs. They filmed their violence. They spread it online. Fear traveled faster than armies. A single post, a single video could shake the world. Their tactics were brutal. Beheadings, bombings, enslavement, horrors made public for all to see. Cities like Mosul and Raqqa became battlegrounds of the new age, where drones circled overhead and civilians walked streets lined with rubble and silence. But terrorism didn't stay in the Middle East. It spread. It moved like a shadow across Europe, across Asia, across the world. In London, buses and subways were bombed. In Paris, music halls and cafes were turned into war zones. In Mumbai, hotels and train stations became sites of siege. And in cities across the West, lone attackers, inspired not by orders but by ideology, struck schools, markets, marathons, and places of worship. Terrorism had no capital now, no borders, no front lines. It could come from a cave or a computer, from a battlefield or a bedroom. The fear was not just of what had happened, but of what could. Governments raced to adapt. Airports became fortresses. Surveillance grew. New laws passed in the name of safety. The word homeland became a shield and a slogan. People began to live in a state of low hum, not of peace, not of war, but of watchfulness. Terror without borders meant that war could no longer be declared in the old way, because the enemy was no longer a nation, a uniform, or a flag. It was a belief, a whisper, a possibility. And so the world changed, not with grand invasions, but with quiet, constant vigilance. The war we still feel. Years have passed. The smoke of September 11th no longer stains the sky. The rubble has been cleared. In its place stands a memorial. Two deep pools where the towers once rose, water falling endlessly into silence. Names carved in stone. A museum underground, where shoes, letters, and twisted steel tell the story of that day. But the war, the one that began with falling towers, is not over. Not really. Continues in ways harder to see. In policies, in politics, in the way people move through airports, through cities, through conversations. The word terror still echoes in headlines. Drones still circle skies. Troops still deploy. Refugees still flee from lands shaken by battles that began decades ago. There is also a quieter war inside. A war of memory, of trauma. Veterans return home carrying invisible wounds. Survivors carry anniversaries like weights. Children born after 2001 grow up in a world shaped by a day they never saw but still feel. We build walls now, not just on borders but in minds. Suspicion sometimes replaces trust. Safety becomes a currency traded for privacy, for peace of mind. The balance between freedom and fear is a tightrope the world now walks. And yet, amid all this, there is resilience. People still gather, still rebuild, still hope. In the darkness of that morning in September, there were also lights, the firefighters, the strangers helping strangers, the hands reaching out through smoke and rubble. That spirit remains. The war we still feel is not just about loss. It is also about how we remember, how we choose to live in a world that has known such sorrow. It is about what we protect, not just from harm, but from forgetting. And as the years pass, the story of that day, of that war, becomes not just a chapter in history, but a part of who we are. In the quiet of night, when the world grows still, echoes remain, not just of terror, but of courage. Not just of fear, but of firemen climbing stairs, of voices saying, "We will never forget." The skyline changed, the world changed, but somewhere in that change, so did we, learning, watching, remembering. The war is not gone, but neither is the light. And as each September passes, we pause, not just to mourn, but to carry forward what matters most. The promise that even shattered skies can still find stars. Chapter 14, Cyberspace and Silent Wars. In the quiet hum of data centers and the glowing blue screens of everyday life, a new kind of war has emerged. One without soldiers, battlefields, or bombs. Instead of tanks rolling across borders, lines of code breach firewalls. The front lines are now fiber optic cables, and the battlefield is invisible. Around the world, governments, hackers, and digital warriors fight in silence. Their weapons not rifles but keyboards. In 2007, the small Baltic nation of Estonia became one of the first major victims of a large-scale cyber attack. Banks, newspapers, and even government ministries went offline for days. The source was never fully confirmed, but many pointed fingers at a neighboring power displeased with a Soviet statue being moved. The world took notice. It was a new kind of attack, one that needed no army, just access and intent. From there, the digital race quickened. Stuxnet, a mysterious piece of malware discovered in 2010, quietly damaged Iran's nuclear program. It was crafted not to steal information, but to break machines. Spinning centrifuges too fast, then too slow, it destroyed them from within. It was one of the first known pieces of software designed to cause real-world damage, and it worked. Across continents, the list of digital skirmishes grew. Power grids in Ukraine flickered and died in coordinated hacks. Corporate secrets were leaked and manipulated. Governments spied not with satellites alone, but with smartphones, routers, and internet traffic. The world had shifted. Wars could now be fought without a single shot being fired, and yet the impact was just as real. This invisible warfare is not limited to governments. Private actors, hacktivist groups, and even lone individuals now hold the power to disrupt nations. A teenager in one country can crash websites on another continent. A group of online activists can release sensitive data to the world, reshaping public opinion in an instant. The keyboard has become a weapon, one that anyone, anywhere, can wield. Information as ammunition. In this new era, it is not only networks and systems under attack. The mind itself has become a target. What we believe, what we trust, what we fear, these are now tools of war. Disinformation campaigns spread across social media like wildfire, turning truth into a battlefield. In 2016, the US presidential election became a global focal point for this silent war. Investigations later showed coordinated efforts to flood social platforms with misleading posts, fake news articles, and divisive content. These weren't just trolls with opinions, they were part of organized campaigns. Their goal was not to support one side, but to divide, to confuse, to shake the very foundation of shared reality. This kind of attack is more dangerous than it seems. It doesn't shut off the lights or knock down buildings. Instead, it changes how people see the world. If citizens begin to doubt everything, even the truth, democracy becomes fragile. A divided public is easier to control. A confused nation is slower to act. Around the globe, this method spread. Elections in France, Germany, Brazil, and many others faced waves of false narratives and targeted misinformation. Bots, automated accounts, pretend to be real people, amplifying lies faster than fact-checkers can respond. Videos are edited, voices cloned, and headlines twisted. In this fog, even honest people begin to wonder what is real. Truth, once a shared foundation, now feels like shifting sand. And that uncertainty is not a byproduct of the war, it is the goal. When we no longer know who to trust, when every fact is up for debate, control slips quietly away from the people. This is war without bullets, and yet its damage can last for generations. Corporate empires. As the digital landscape expanded, another shift took place. This one less hidden but just as powerful. The rise of multinational tech companies began to reshape the balance of global power. Corporations like Google, Apple, Amazon, and Meta don't just sell products. They manage information, infrastructure, and even speech. In many ways, their reach goes further than any government's. These companies own the platforms where news is shared, where opinions are formed, and where billions connect. With the power to decide what content is shown and what is hidden, they act as quiet gatekeepers of public thought. Algorithms, invisible to the user, decide which videos rise and which voices fade. The influence is enormous and largely unchecked. In some cases, these corporations handle functions once reserved for states. They develop their own maps, their own currencies, their own security systems. They build cloud infrastructures that host the data of hospitals, banks, and entire governments. If a country cuts ties with a tech provider, it risks losing access to essential services. Dependence runs deep. Yet, while their power grows, these companies operate across borders, answering to no single nation. A decision made in Silicon Valley can shape protests in Hong Kong. A change in policy in Seattle can affect elections in Nairobi. This borderless influence creates a new kind of empire, one that doesn't need armies or land. Its strength is built on servers and users, data and trust. Governments have begun to push back, launching investigations, passing digital rights laws, and demanding more control. But the lines are blurry. These tech giants are not just companies. They are platforms for speech, drivers of economies, and owners of vast digital territory. In this new world, power is no longer just in the hands of kings and presidents. It is held by coders, CEOs, and the unseen systems they manage. security, or surveillance. As cyber threats grew and disinformation spread, nations responded in ways they believed would keep people safe. Firewalls were built. Monitoring systems were expanded. Surveillance became a tool not just of war, but of peacekeeping. Yet with every camera installed, every email scanned, a question lingered: what are we protecting, and at what cost? In China, the government rolled out a vast surveillance system known as the social credit score. Cameras watch public spaces. Algorithms analyze behavior. The goal is to encourage trust and order, but critics warn of something darker: a society where every move is tracked and every mistake is remembered. Privacy becomes a luxury, and obedience is rewarded. The West, too, has grappled with this dilemma. After September 11th, the United States passed sweeping laws to monitor potential threats. Phone calls were recorded. Internet activity was tracked. Intelligence agencies claimed it was necessary to stop attacks before they happened. But whistleblowers like Edward Snowden revealed just how far the spying had gone, even on citizens not suspected of any crime. The balance is delicate. On one hand, governments have a duty to protect their people. On the other, too much control risks slipping into tyranny. Surveillance can stop a terrorist, but it can also silence a dissident. The same tools used to find criminals can be turned on journalists, activists, or ordinary people who speak too loudly. Citizens today live under a web of quiet observation. Smartphones track locations. Smart speakers listen for commands. Apps collect more than they reveal. We sign away privacy with a click, often unaware of what we've given. In the name of convenience, we invite watchers into our homes, our conversations, our lives. And so, the final war of the 21st century may not be fought with missiles or malware, but with questions. What does safety truly mean? How much freedom are we willing to trade for peace? Can a society be both secure and free, both open and protected? There are no easy answers, only choices. Silent, steady choices made in laws, in code, and in every click. And in the stillness of this digital battlefield, the future is written not in fire, but in light. Soft, glowing, ever-watching light. Chapter 15, Proxy Fires of the Present. Across the globe, a quiet intensity lingers, not always visible, but always present. In boardrooms, on satellite feeds, and behind encrypted calls, the great powers of the world once again dance along the edge of confrontation. The Cold War may have ended on paper, but its shadows have crept forward, taking new forms in old places. The United States and Russia, no longer locked in a binary standoff, now navigate a fractured and unpredictable landscape. China, once watching from the sidelines, now steps confidently into the arena, challenging assumptions and unsettling alliances. NATO's presence has expanded eastward since the 1990s, drawing a new line across Europe that many hoped would bring security, but also sparked anxiety in Moscow. Russia's response has been assertive, strategic, and often subtle. Ukraine became the flashpoint. In 2014, the annexation of Crimea sent shockwaves through the world. It was a signal, a reminder that borders are not always permanent, and that the old rules of influence still apply. The war that followed did not wear the uniforms of the past. It was fought in trenches and cities, yes, but also in cyberspace and global media. A war of perception as much as territory. Meanwhile, China rises with quiet strength. Its ambitions are woven into the sea lanes of the South China Sea and the supply chains of the world. Taiwan, long a delicate thread in East Asian diplomacy, becomes the subject of louder speeches and riskier maneuvers. American warships pass through contested waters. Chinese jets answer with drills. The battles are not declared, but they are rehearsed, again and again, under the watchful eyes of satellites and analysts. This is not one war. It is many layers of tension stacked together. Like tectonic plates pressing beneath the surface, the movements are slow, but pressure builds. From Eastern Europe to East Asia, from the Arctic Circle to the Horn of Africa, the chessboard stretches wide. But this is no longer a game of black and white pieces. Each nation moves not only for territory, but for leverage, for stability, for pride. No bombs fall on Washington or Beijing, and no tanks roll into Berlin or Tokyo. But the threat lingers. Proxy fires burn where the heat is bearable, and the players keep their distance for now. Old borders, new battles. Maps, they say, are drawn in ink but shaped by blood. Borders created in haste or carved by empire often outlive the powers that made them, but not without consequence. In many places today, the lines drawn decades or centuries ago are cracking open. These are not just geographic divisions. They are scars of identity, belief, and history, carried across generations and reawakened by conflict. In the Middle East, Yemen groans under the weight of a war that is both deeply local and frighteningly global. What began as a political struggle evolved into a devastating civil war, drawing in regional powers. Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, all have found reasons to enter, support, or resist. But the people on the ground bear the cost. Ancient cities crumble under airstrikes. Families flee into deserts. And once more, a line once drawn in sand becomes a trench of sorrow. In Africa, similar echoes ring out. In Ethiopia, ethnic tensions erupt into violence despite years of peace. The Tigray War reawakened wounds many thought were healing. Villages burn. Children disappear. Aid convoys are blocked or bombed. This is not just about one region. It is a reminder that modern wars do not always start with declarations, nor do they follow neat narratives. They rise from histories left unresolved. Religious tension adds another layer. In parts of South Asia, the divisions between Hindu and Muslim communities have become flashpoints once more. In Kashmir, long contested, military patrols walk narrow passes while civilians live under curfews. In Myanmar, the Rohingya, a Muslim minority, have been driven from their homes, stateless and hunted, in a campaign the world struggled to stop. These are not wars of empires or conquest. They are battles over who belongs, who rules, who remembers. Often fueled by colonial legacies or political ambition, the violence erupts in places the world cannot always see, but cannot afford to ignore. Old borders may fade on paper, but they endure in hearts. And where lines of history cross the pain of the present, the fires continue to flare. Sanctions and soft power. Not all battles are fought with bullets. In today's world, power can be projected without a single soldier crossing a border. Sanctions, economic weapons, are now wielded as both punishment and warning. Where once armies marched, now money is halted. Accounts are frozen, trade is cut, and economies strain under the weight of political messages. The United States and the European Union have used sanctions widely, against Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, against Iran for its nuclear ambitions, against North Korea for its provocations. These measures target banks, leaders, industries. In theory, they hurt the powerful. In practice, they often touch everyone. Inflation rises. Imports vanish. Basic needs become luxuries. And in the minds of many, the line between politics and punishment blurs. China, meanwhile, deploys its own version of soft power, but through infrastructure, diplomacy, and trade. The Belt and Road Initiative stretches across continents, offering loans, roads, ports, and railways to countries in need of development. But with this aid comes influence. Critics warn of debt traps. Supporters see opportunity. Either way, the world feels the presence of a nation no longer content to be silent. Media plays its part as well. Narratives are crafted, broadcast, shared. Governments invest in global news outlets. Propaganda shifts from posters to pixels. In every language, in every region, stories compete for belief. Soft power, at its core, is about persuasion, about shaping the way people think, feel, and choose. In classrooms and cinemas, in apps and embassies, this battle continues with quiet persistence. In this era, a collapsed currency can destroy more than a dropped bomb. A rumor can unsettle a region. A boycott can weaken a government. And as nations learn to wield these tools, the lines between war and peace become ever more faint. It is a quieter kind of fire, but no less consuming. The global refugee crisis. When the bombs fall or the borders break, it is the people who move. In boats, on foot, with babies on backs and fear in their eyes, they travel roads no one should have to take. The world today faces a refugee crisis unlike any since the Second World War. From Syria to Sudan, from Venezuela to Afghanistan, millions have fled, not for dreams, but for survival. Camps swell on the edges of nations. Some are made of tents and tarps, others of concrete and barbed wire. Children grow up knowing only displacement. Their lullabies are distant gunfire. Their textbooks are missing. Their future is blurred by borders that may never open. Host countries strain to cope. Politics bristle. And the question echoes louder each year. Who will take them in? In Europe, boats arrive on distant shores. Some are rescued. Some sink. The Mediterranean becomes not just a sea, but a graveyard. In the Americas, caravans walk north. They flee gangs, poverty, violence. But walls rise to meet them. Papers are demanded. Hope is detained. And the journey, already hard, becomes dangerous. But the crisis is not only about numbers. It is about stories. A Syrian father selling sweets to keep his family warm in winter. A Congolese girl carrying a baby brother to safety. An Afghan widow leaving everything behind for a future she cannot see. Behind every statistic is a name, a voice, a memory. And in their movement, the world sees its reflection. Fractured, fragile, and full of longing. International agencies do what they can. Food, shelter, aid. But the needs grow faster than the help. Climate change adds fuel to the fire. Droughts, floods, rising seas, they too force people to move. The term climate refugee becomes more common, and the planet begins to understand that, in the end, we are all connected by displacement. The wars of the present do not stay where they start. Their flames send smoke into every corner of the earth. And though some may never hear the gunfire, they will feel the wind of those running from it. This is the true face of modern conflict. Not just soldiers or sanctions, but the silent march of the displaced. Chapter 16, Memory and Monument. In the quiet after the battle, the way we remember takes shape. Fields once red with blood become calm stretches of green. Names once shouted in command become engraved in stone. Monuments rise like solemn sentinels, guarding stories that stretch beyond the reach of time. But memory is not always fixed. It shifts. It bends. It depends on who tells it and who listens. Across continents, textbooks open to different pages. One nation might call it a victory, while another mourns it as a loss. What is remembered in one classroom is often left out in another. In Germany, the story of World War II is taught with heavy eyes and honest hearts. A tale of what went wrong, so it may never be repeated. In Japan, the war is remembered too, but not always in the same words. Some textbooks avoid the darkest parts. Some avoid names, and in doing so, they risk avoiding the lesson. Tombs tell a different tale. In France, the grave of the unknown soldier lies beneath the Arc de Triomphe, with an eternal flame that never goes out. No name is written on the tomb because it could be anyone, and so it honors everyone. In Arlington, white stones stretch for acres, like quiet pages in a book no one can finish reading. Each name, each date, each rank, a line of history held still in time. But even tombs can be political. In Russia, monuments to World War II heroes still stand tall, not only for remembrance but also for pride. In Ukraine, some of those same statues have been taken down, symbols of a past they no longer wish to carry. History is not only what happened, it's what we choose to remember, and what we choose to forget. Memory, in this way, is more than just facts. It is narrative. It is purpose. It is the story we tell ourselves to make sense of what was, and to shape what will be. Every tombstone and every textbook is a reflection not only of the past, but of the future we hope to build. The stories of survivors. Long after the last shot is fired, the voices of survivors remain. They do not echo from stone. They do not live in books. They come from people, real people, with eyes that have seen too much and hearts that have carried the weight of it all. Their stories are not always polished. They stutter. They pause. But they carry truths that no textbook can teach. In villages and cities, in nursing homes and veterans' halls, men and women sit with memories as sharp as broken glass. A British soldier from the Falklands speaks of the cold, not just in the air, but in his bones. A Korean War veteran remembers the silence after the bombs, louder than the explosions themselves. A nurse from Vietnam recalls the smell of iodine and fear, and the hands she held until they went still. Sometimes they tell their stories willingly, other times only when asked gently. There is pain in remembering, but sometimes more pain in being forgotten. In Rwanda, survivors of the genocide speak softly, with eyes that look far away. They remember neighbors who became enemies overnight. They remember hiding in silence. They remember the moment the silence broke. Survivors do not always have answers. They do not always know what it was all for, but their stories bring a kind of truth that is hard to deny. They remind us that war is not strategy and speeches. It is hunger. It is fear. It is the sound of footsteps outside your door. And still, many find courage to speak. In classrooms, they sit before rows of young faces and tell them not to look away. In documentaries, their voices crack as they recall what it cost. In courtrooms, they testify not for vengeance but for history, so that the next generation might know and might choose differently. There is a strength in these voices, not in volume but in honesty. They carry the weight of battles no one else saw and offer them to the world like a gift, a fragile, sacred gift, the kind that says, I remember, so you won't have to live it again. Commemorating conflict, monuments rise, not always in glory, but often in grief. In Washington, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial stretches low to the ground, a black wall with names carved deep, reflecting the face of every person who approaches. No flags, no statues, just names. It's not a celebration. It's a wound open for the world to see. And yet people come. They touch the names. They leave flowers, letters, photos. They remember. Elsewhere, silence speaks louder than marble. In Hiroshima, the Peace Memorial Park stands not with grandeur, but with gentleness. The atomic dome remains, a skeleton of a building left as it was after the bomb. Around it, trees have grown again, and children laugh in the distance. Life goes on even where it was once taken. The message is not revenge. It is peace, but not all remembrance is clear or kind. Some statues stand in defiance, honoring men who brought more pain than peace. In the American South, statues of Confederate generals have long been debated. For some, they are history. For others, they are harm. And slowly, many have come down, not to erase the past, but to stop honoring the wrong parts of it. Every nation remembers differently. In South Africa, the Apartheid Museum tells its story in stark contrast. Black and white photographs, voices echoing through the halls, and signs that divide visitors by race at the entrance, just as they once did in life. It is uncomfortable. It is meant to be. In Germany, no statues honor Nazi leaders. No streets bear their names. Instead, the memorials focus on victims, on those who suffered, not those who caused it. Small brass plates called Stolperstein, or stumbling stones, are set into sidewalks across cities, each bearing the name of a person taken by the Holocaust. You might trip over them if you don't look down. And that is the point. Memory can be loud, or it can be quiet. It can be carved into stone, or whispered in prayer. But always it carries a message, not just of what was, but of who we are now and who we choose to become. The war within us. Some wars never end. Not in treaties, not in silence, not even in time. They live on, not in trenches, but in hearts. Passed down like inheritance, the weight of war becomes part of the generations that follow, even those who never held a gun or heard the sound of sirens. Children grow up hearing the stories. A grandfather's limp, a mother's tears, a photograph on a wall, framed with pride and sorrow. Sometimes the war is never mentioned, and yet its shadow stretches long. The anger, the fear, the silence, all of it becomes part of the next chapter. In many places, old wars shape new politics. Old borders, drawn in war, still divide families and friends. Old wounds, left unhealed, lead to new tensions. The past is not past. It breathes through policy, through prejudice, through protest. Even in peace, the war lingers. In nightmares, in hospitals, in songs and silences. A soldier returns home, but not the same. A refugee builds a new life, but never leaves behind the one they fled. A child grows up with a parent who startles at loud sounds, who avoids certain roads, who cannot speak of certain days. But from these quiet wars, something else can rise: understanding. When we listen, truly listen, to the pain of the past, we begin to soften the sharp edges of tomorrow. Education becomes a shield, empathy a kind of armor, memory becomes a map, guiding us not toward more war, but away from it. And so we carry the lessons, not in bitterness, not in fear, but in awareness. We build classrooms where history is taught with honesty. We build homes where silence is gently opened. We build lives that say, "This pain is not mine, but I will not ignore it." There is a kind of peace that comes not from forgetting war, but from remembering it well, from holding its truth with care, from refusing to look away. And in doing so, we pass on something greater than sorrow. We pass on the wisdom that makes peace possible. Because memory, in the end, is not about looking backward. It is about looking forward, with eyes that see the cost of conflict, and hearts that choose another way. Chapter 17, The Science of War. The story of war is also the story of invention. As long as humans have fought, they have imagined new ways to fight more efficiently. The weapons of war have always been more than metal and fire. They are mirrors of the minds that make them, tools forged not only from steel, but from fear, ambition, and curiosity. In ancient Greece, the concept of Greek fire emerged, a mysterious liquid that could burn even on water. It was a weapon so feared it was treated like a state secret. Later came the trebuchets of medieval Europe, capable of hurling boulders across castle walls with terrifying force. As the centuries passed, these tools grew more precise, more efficient, more lethal. Gunpowder arrived from the east, changing everything. Battles once fought with swords and spears gave way to explosions and musket lines. The battlefield became louder, smokier, more unpredictable. In the 19th century, rifles replaced muskets, and then came machine guns. World War I turned these innovations into horrors of industrial slaughter. The machine gun, the tank, the flamethrower, all inventions of war, all turning human invention into mass destruction. Then came the most dramatic leap of all, the atomic bomb. A single flash of light above Hiroshima signaled a terrifying new era. One bomb, one plane, one city leveled. The science that powered it came from years of study in physics, but its application was born in the fires of World War II. Nuclear weapons reshaped the meaning of war itself. From conquest and combat, war became a balance of fear, a standoff between nations with the power to end the world. Yet the innovation never stopped. The Cold War brought computers, satellites, and missile systems. Today, the cutting edge of military science lies in invisible code and autonomous machines. Cyber warfare, stealth drones, and robotic scouts now patrol digital and physical skies. Even algorithms, silent lines of code, are weapons in modern conflict. Artificial intelligence helps generals decide when to strike. And in some places, machines make that decision themselves. The tools of war have evolved far beyond the battlefield. They now reach into the skies, into the seas, into space, and into the minds of those who wield them. Each advancement changes the rules of engagement. The sword demanded strength. The rifle required aim. The drone needs only a distant operator. And so, with every leap in technology, the distance between the soldier and the battlefield grows. War becomes easier to wage, harder to feel, and perhaps more dangerous than ever. Medical miracles in battlefields. But war does not only bring destruction. It also accelerates the science of saving lives. On the battlefield, wounds are not theoretical. They are real, immediate, and everywhere. That urgency drives innovation. In the Civil War, the need to treat gunshot wounds gave rise to early methods of trauma surgery. The concept of triage, sorting patients based on the severity of their wounds, was born on these bloody fields. World War I introduced antiseptics on a large scale. Doctors realized that keeping wounds clean was just as important as sealing them. And with so many soldiers returning with injuries, the medical community had no choice but to adapt. New methods for treating burns, blood loss, and broken bones were developed quickly. These breakthroughs didn't stay on the battlefield. They came home. They entered hospitals. They saved civilians. In World War II, mobile surgical units followed the troops. These became the foundation for the emergency rooms we know today. Blood banks were established to store blood safely, leading to modern transfusion techniques. Penicillin, discovered before the war, became mass-produced because of it. It turned deadly infections into survivable ones, saving millions of lives. Helicopters were used in the Korean War not just to attack, but to rescue. Medical evacuation by air revolutionized trauma response. Vietnam pushed it even further. Soldiers were pulled from jungles and treated within minutes, not hours. This was the beginning of modern emergency medical services, the paramedics, the ER teams, the rescue helicopters we depend on now. In more recent conflicts, advances in prosthetics have transformed how amputees recover. What was once a wooden peg is now a robotic limb. Soldiers with traumatic brain injuries inspired new research into neuroscience. PTSD, once misunderstood or ignored, is now a serious field of study in psychology and mental health. The battlefield is brutal, but it also forces humanity to push the boundaries of care. In that chaos, doctors learn, scientists adapt, nurses innovate, and when the war ends, those lessons follow us home. They enter our ambulances, our hospitals, our medical schools. War reveals the worst of us. But in medicine, it sometimes brings out our best. The ethics of progress. With every invention, a question follows. Should we use it? Just because something is possible does not make it right. The history of warfare is filled with moral crossroads. Moments where science advanced, but humanity hesitated. The atomic bomb was one of the first and clearest. Scientists on the Manhattan Project understood its power. Some warned against its use. Others believed it would end the war. But once dropped, the world was never the same. Chemical weapons were another boundary. Chlorine and mustard gas choked soldiers in the trenches of World War I. After seeing their effects, the global community tried to ban them. But that didn't stop new forms of chemical and biological warfare from emerging. Behind the scenes, experiments continued, often in secret, sometimes in violation of ethics. The Cold War brought new ethical dilemmas. Psychological experiments, surveillance programs, and covert technologies were developed in the name of security. But at what cost? In the race to outthink the enemy, the lines between defense and violation blurred. Drones and artificial intelligence pose new challenges today. Who is accountable when a machine makes a mistake? Who is responsible when a drone targets the wrong building? Ethics must race to keep up with technology, but it often lags behind. There is always a gap between what we can do and what we agree should be done. Even now, in labs around the world, weapons are being built that might never be used, or might one day be used in ways we cannot yet imagine. Scientists and soldiers alike must wrestle with these questions. Is deterrence a just reason for creation? Is fear a valid justification for research? How do we balance national safety with global humanity? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones, because progress without ethics is like a compass without direction, fast but lost. And so, every step forward in science brings with it a quiet echo. Not just, can we? But also, should we? And if history has taught us anything, it is that the answers we choose or fail to choose shape the world our children inherit. Civilian science, military roots. When we use GPS to navigate a city, we rarely think about satellites launched for war. When we text a friend, we don't consider the early military networks that laid the foundation for the internet. But many of the tools we now consider essential, tools that define our modern lives, began in military laboratories. Take the jet engine. Born from the need for speed and altitude in combat, it now powers commercial planes that carry millions of people each day. Or consider radar. First used to detect enemy aircraft, it now guides weather forecasts and helps ships avoid storms. Microwave ovens, once a result of radar experiments, now sit quietly in kitchens around the world. Even duct tape, a battlefield invention, became a household staple. And then there's the internet itself. The early framework, ARPANET, was built to ensure communication between military bases. Today, it connects the globe. The space race, too, began with missiles, but it ended with moon landings, satellites, and science stations in orbit. GPS started as a military positioning system. Now it helps us find restaurants, monitor traffic, and locate lost pets. Medical tools, too, carry military roots. Tourniquets, field dressings, portable defibrillators, all designed for war, all used now in ambulances and homes. Even modern trauma centers follow battlefield logic. Speed, precision, coordination. These inventions are silent echoes of conflict. They are the civilian benefits of military urgency. War demands solutions, and sometimes those solutions overflow into peace. The same labs that build weapons often birth wonders. The same minds that design destruction also shape convenience. And while we wish it were not so, that such progress could come without pain, the truth is much of what we cherish today grew from the soil of conflict. War is a terrible teacher, but its lessons linger. In our skies, our phones, our medicine, our machines, the science of war lives on, shaping the peace we now strive to keep. Chapter 18, War's Last Whisper. From deserts to cities, every war leaves ghosts. It begins not with gunfire or marching boots, but with silence. A silence that settles after the last battle, when the dust has fallen and the echoes have quieted. Across the world, from burning sands to crumbled stone, from jungles once torn by bullets to city squares emptied by fear, war leaves a mark no broom can sweep, no monument can entirely mend. Every place touched by conflict remembers, whether through broken walls or broken hearts. In the deserts of North Africa, the wind still carries the secrets of fallen empires. Bunkers half buried in sand, rusting vehicles forgotten by time, and shells of towns that once teemed with life. They remain like open wounds. Even now, decades later, there are paths too dangerous to walk, not because of enemies, but because of the hidden mines that still lie beneath the soil. Deadly reminders of a war no longer fought but never truly ended. In cities where glass towers now rise, war's shadow still lingers. A scar across a stone facade, a park that used to be a mass grave, a statue standing tall not to celebrate victory, but to grieve. Children walk by them, perhaps unaware, but their grandparents know. Their grandparents remember what the sky looked like when it fell, when sirens sang instead of birds, and the ground itself seemed to roar. In Eastern Europe, many forests still hide the skeletons of forgotten battles. Trees grow where trenches once carved deep lines in the earth. The soil has absorbed blood, metal, and fire, and yet the moss returns each spring. Nature does not forget, but she heals with time. She covers history, not to erase it, but to give it a resting place. And across the sea, in Pacific islands too small to find on most maps, the bones of ships lie just beneath the waves. Corroded steel and silent decks now serve as reefs, homes to fish and coral. Life returns, but divers who descend to these watery graves say it feels as though the ocean itself holds its breath down there, remembering what happened when the sky dropped bombs and the sea turned black. Every war changes the world, sometimes in visible ways, borders redrawn, cities rebuilt, alliances forged. But just as often, the change is invisible. A parent's fear, a community's silence, a people's memory. War does not end with treaties. It ends when those echoes grow too faint to hear, and even then, the silence is never quite complete. Can we unlearn war? Diplomacy, deterrence, and disarmament. Fragile hopes in a volatile world. It is one thing to survive war. It is another to unlearn it. Throughout history, war has been humanity's most practiced skill, sharpened over centuries, refined with every passing generation. From bronze swords to smart bombs, we've poured our brightest minds into the art of destruction. But can a species so well trained in war ever forget how to fight? The answer, perhaps, lies in the quiet chambers of diplomacy, in boardrooms and embassies where enemies sit face to face and speak instead of strike. Diplomacy is not dramatic. It does not march. It does not roar. But it saves. It delays. And sometimes it prevents. The world has often come close to the edge. Nuclear clocks ticking toward midnight, fingers hovering over terrible buttons, only to be pulled back by the softest of tools. A letter, a phone call, a treaty. Deterrence is more complicated. It is the uneasy peace built on fear. If I strike, you will strike back harder. So we wait, watch, and hope that fear alone will be enough to keep hands steady. In the Cold War, this balance held barely. Missiles stood ready, oceans bristled with submarines, but the ultimate weapon was never used. Some call this peace, others call it luck. Then there is disarmament, the act of stepping back, of saying, enough. It is rare, it is fragile, it requires trust, and trust is scarce in a world where lies are often spoken louder than truth. Treaties are signed and broken, weapons are destroyed and rebuilt, and still hope flickers. In some corners of the world, former foes have dismantled their arms, buried the past, and shaken hands. These moments are small, but they are real. Can we unlearn war? Not by forgetting it, but perhaps by remembering it too well. When the images are too painful, the graves too many, and the silence too deep, maybe then we will stop teaching war and start learning peace. The challenge is not knowing how to destroy, we've mastered that. The challenge is learning how to build without fear, how to disagree without fire, and how to live without turning anger into arms. The price of peace. Peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of justice. Peace has often been imagined as a gentle quiet, a time when weapons rest and people sleep without fear. But true peace is not quiet at all. It is work. It is repair. It is the daily, difficult task of justice. After war, many are left with empty hands and aching hearts. Cities must be rebuilt. Governments must be reimagined. And wounds, both visible and hidden, must be tended. Peace means listening to those who have lost the most. It means returning what was taken, healing what was broken, and acknowledging what was done. In post-war Germany, peace did not come with surrender, it came with reckoning. Trials were held, not to punish for revenge, but to draw a line between right and wrong. The world watched as evidence was laid bare, as victims spoke their truths, and as those responsible faced the judgment of history. It was not perfect, it was not enough, but it was a beginning. In South Africa, after decades of apartheid, peace came not just through elections but through forgiveness. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission did not erase the pain, but it gave voice to it. Victims stood beside perpetrators and told the truth, no matter how raw. Peace, in that fragile moment, was built not on silence, but on speech. In Rwanda, after one of the most horrifying genocides of the 20th century, peace meant facing neighbors who had become killers. Community courts, called Gakaka, brought people together, not in courtrooms but in fields and under trees. There, the guilty confessed and the grieving wept. It was imperfect, but it was human, and sometimes that's all peace can be. Peace demands more than quiet. It demands fairness, safety, equality. It means making sure the roots of war, hatred, fear, injustice are pulled out by hand, one by one. And that work never ends. It continues in classrooms, in protests, in laws, and in every heart that chooses not to hate. To truly end war, we must build a world where no one needs it, where justice is not a dream but a daily reality, and where peace is not the silence between bombs, but the song that rises after. Final echoes, a soldier's letter, a silent battlefield, the whisper of history asking if we've heard it. Somewhere, far from home, a soldier once sat beneath a pale moon and wrote a letter. His hands were dirty, his boots soaked, his eyes heavy, but his words were clear. He wrote not about glory or hatred, but about his mother's garden, about the girl he'd left behind, about the dog that used to follow him through the fields. He folded the paper with care, sealed it, and handed it to a friend, just in case. That letter was never sent. Years later, a farmer found it, buried in a rusted tin box beneath a shattered tree. The words were smudged, but readable. They spoke not of war, but of life, of what was lost. And in that small note, war whispered its truest truth, that every battle fought takes something from someone who never asked for it. On a battlefield now covered with grass, the silence is almost sacred. No flags wave, no music plays, just the wind and the birds and the soft hush of memory. Tourists come and go, some red plaques, others simply stand still, and the earth listens quietly. History has always whispered, through ashes, through ruins, through the cracks in stone and the rust of steel. It asks us, gently but firmly, did you hear what happened here? Will you remember? Will you learn? In the end, the last whisper of war is not a command. It is a question, one that floats on the wind, waiting for an answer. Not from generals, not from leaders, but from us, the ones who still walk the world war left behind. If we listen closely, we may still hear it. And if we truly hear it, perhaps finally we'll know how to answer.